Hey there, night owls! Tonight we're tracing the entire life story of the Antichrist straight from the Bible. Not the cartoon version where a bad guy shows up, does his villain thing, and gets flattened in the final act. The real one. His rise, his fake world peace, his staged comeback from the grave, his 666 economy, and the single hour it all comes crashing down. It's all in there, chopped up across Daniel and Revelation, and tonight we finally line every piece up. You'll watch him claw to the top without firing a shot, fool the whole planet, and crown himself a god right before it blows up in his face. And there's a twist at the end that makes most Hollywood scripts look lazy. But first, do me a quick favour. Tap that like button if you love a proper deep dive, and drop a comment telling me where on this planet you're watching from and what time it is right now. I want to know who's riding along tonight. Alright, get comfy, kill the noise, and let's roll. So here is the first thing that trips almost everyone up. The story does not begin with him. It begins with the room he walks into. Before you can have a villain, you need a stage, a set, and an audience already seated and quietly begging for someone to step into the spotlight. And the deeply uncomfortable idea buried in these old texts is that the audience builds that stage themselves, brick by brick, usually while congratulating themselves on how reasonable they are being about the whole thing. Picture the world he inherits, not some peaceful garden with birdsong, a planet stretched thin and running on fumes, wars flickering across every continent, a handful loud enough to make the headlines, most of them quiet enough to be forgotten before dessert. Economies that wobble like a toddler on roller skates, promising rock-solid stability one week and quietly erasing somebody's life savings the next. And humming underneath all of it, a low, grinding suspicion that the old rules simply do not hold anymore, that whatever invisible glue used to keep societies polite and predictable has come unstuck while nobody was watching. It is exactly the kind of atmosphere in which people stop asking who is right and start asking, with real urgency, who can just make the noise stop. That last part is the load-bearing wall of this entire story, so grab onto it and do not let go. Exhausted people do not crave freedom. They crave relief. Hand a frightened, worn-out crowd a choice between liberty that demands patience and order that arrives first thing tomorrow morning, and the crowd will reach for order almost every single time, and then write a thank you note for the privilege. History has run this exact experiment more times than anyone likes to bring up at dinner parties, and the results are so consistent they are almost dull. A society in genuine pain will trade an astonishing amount of its freedom for the simple promise that someone competent is finally in charge. It rarely reads the fine print. The fine print, unfortunately, is where the whole thing lives. And notice which quality actually wins in that moment, because it is not the one you would hope for. A scared crowd does not, in the end, demand that its rescuer be good. It demands that he be effective. Kindness is a luxury for calmer years. When the ground is genuinely shaking, people will forgive almost anything in a leader who can promise the shaking will stop, and they will do it while telling themselves they had no other choice. That single reflex, the willingness to swap character for competence, is the crack in the wall that everything else in this story eventually pours through. There is a second reflex working right alongside the first, and it is even easier to exploit. A desperate crowd does not wait for a rescuer to explain himself in careful detail. It projects. The moment a confident figure steps forward and says the right few words, everyone in the audience quietly fills in the rest, painting onto that blank canvas whatever they personally have been aching to see. The frightened investor sees a man who will protect his money. The grieving parent sees a man who will finally bring the fighting to an end. The exhausted worker sees a man who will make things fair at last. He barely has to describe himself at all. The crowd does the flattering work for him, each person quietly building a private version of the hero they need, then falling in love with their own construction. That is the sneaky genius of the whole setup. A counterfeit does not have to be very persuasive when the audience is already this eager to persuade itself. Then there is the third leg of the whole rickety table, the one that is quietest and does the most damage, wars you can see. Broken economies you can measure, but the slow erosion of any shared sense of what is even true or decent is the kind of decay that does not announce itself. When a society loses its common flaw, when people can no longer agree on the most basic standards, they do not become calmly independent thinkers. They become tired, disoriented, and secretly desperate for someone from the outside to walk in and tell them where the lines are again. A crowd that has lost its own compass will happily follow anyone who seems to have one, and it will not check very carefully whether that compass is pointing anywhere good. Now, the obvious question, the one that has kept people up at night for 2,000 years, is simple enough. If the world has been miserable and unstable on and off for basically all of recorded history, why has the main event not already happened? Plenty of centuries had their wars and their crooked economies and their morally exhausted elites. What exactly is everyone supposedly waiting for? The old texts have an answer, and it is a strange one. In a short, urgent letter to a jittery little community in Thessalonica, the Apostle Paul is trying to talk some very anxious people back from a ledge. They have become convinced the end has already started without them, which is the sort of rumour that races through a nervous group like fire through dry grass. And Paul, right in the middle of calming them down, drops a genuinely odd detail. He tells them the man of lawlessness, the figure everything is quietly building toward, simply cannot show up yet. Not, will not, cannot. Because something is actively holding him back. There is a restrainer, a presence or a force standing squarely in the doorway with its arms folded, and for as long as it stands there, the door stays shut and locked tight. Paul is maddeningly vague about what this restrainer actually is, a vagueness that has kept theologians happily arguing ever since, a debate with no referee and no final whistle anywhere in sight. Some insist it is government itself, the entire apparatus of law and order that keeps chaos on a short leash. Some say it is the church. Some say it is the Holy Spirit working quietly behind the scenes of both. The text stubbornly refuses to settle the bill, but while the identity stays fuzzy, the mechanism is crisp and clear, and the mechanism is the part that ought to raise the hair on your arms. Lawlessness, in this picture, is not something still waiting to be invented. It is already fully loaded. It is already leaning hard against the door from the other side. It is simply being held shut. And the very moment the restrainer steps aside, is taken out of the way, removed from the middle of things, all that pressure that has been quietly accumulating century after century finally finds its exit. It is worth pausing on that phrase, the man of lawlessness, because it is more precise than it first sounds. Lawlessness here does not just mean crime, the ordinary rule-breaking that every society deals with on a slow Tuesday. It means the removal of restraint itself, the full and final throwing off of every limit that once held human behaviour in check. It is the logical endpoint of a culture that spent years congratulating itself for shrugging off one boundary after another, never quite noticing that boundaries, tedious as they are, were also the only thing standing between it and the very figure it should fear the most. He is not merely called a lawbreaker. He is described as lawlessness wearing a human face, the thing that arrives once there is nothing left to hold it back, and by the time it shows up it feels less like an invasion and more like a natural conclusion everyone had quietly voted for. That reframes the whole timeline in a way that is far more unsettling than a tidy prediction with a date stamped on it. This is not a calendar. It is a description of a lock finally clicking open. Evil, in this framework, is not a shocking surprise guest who kicks the door off its hinges. It has been standing in the hallway the entire time, patient to a genuinely creepy degree, checking its watch, waiting for its cue with the discipline of a professional who understands that the show cannot possibly start until the right person leaves the room. And here is the part that keeps dragging this ancient material back into every anxious generation's conversation, whether that generation wants it back or not. The conditions the text describes are not exotic. They are not some bizarre alien landscape you would never recognize. They are more or less the evening news wearing slightly older clothes, widespread instability, money that feels a little less solid every year, and a deep spreading hunger for someone, anyone, to simply walk in and take the wheel. Every generation reads these lines and feels a small, involuntary shiver of recognition, because every generation looks around at its own particular mess and thinks, surely it cannot possibly get more chaotic than this. Which, if you check the historical record, has always been an adorably optimistic thing to assume. None of that means the main character has arrived. That is the entire reason we are starting here instead of with him. The stage is dressed, the lights are warm, every seat is filled, and the crowd is restless and murmuring. What is missing is the actor. And the real tragedy stitched into this setup is that the crowd has spent years making itself perfectly, flawlessly ready to accept a counterfeit, precisely because it wants the real thing so desperately. A people starving for a saviour turn out to be the easiest people on the planet to sell a fake one. They are not scanning the horizon for reasons to doubt. They are scanning it for reasons to hope. And hope, aimed in the wrong direction by a skilled enough hand, is the single most exploitable resource in human history. It does not feel like a weakness. It feels like a virtue, right up until the exact moment it is turned against you. So before we can even get a good look at his face, we have to look up and much further back, because the reason he behaves the way he behaves, the reason his entire strange career reads like a dark reflection of somebody else's life, has almost nothing to do with the tired planet waiting to receive him. It has everything to do with a war that was already ancient before the first human being ever drew a breath. To understand the man, you first have to meet the thing standing behind the man, and to meet that, you have to rewind far past where any history book bothers to begin. Back before nations, before cities, before there were any people around to write it down. The old texts are insistent on this point, almost stubborn about it. The conflict we are watching play out on Earth is not the opening scene of anything. It is the second half of a fight that started somewhere else entirely, and by the time humanity shows up blinking and confused, the war is already old and already ugly. The Book of Revelation pauses its earthly chaos to flash a scene that plays like the origin story for the whole disaster. A woman appears, clothed with the sun, the moon beneath her feet, a crown of 12 stars resting on her head, and she's about to give birth. Waiting in front of her, coiled and enormous and red, is a dragon. Positioned so that the instant the child arrives he can devour it. Subtlety, you will notice, was not the goal. This is cosmic theatre painted in the loudest colours the language had lying around, and it is built to be impossible to forget. People have argued for centuries about who the woman actually is. Some read her as the faithful people from whom the promised deliverer comes. Some read her as a picture of the whole community of the faithful across time. As with everything in this strange book, the symbol carries more than one honest reading, and we are not here to slam the case shut. What matters for the story is the dragon's reaction to the child, because that reaction tells you exactly what he is afraid of. He does not lunge at the woman, he lunges at what she produces. His entire posture is that of something terrified of a rescuer arriving, and terror is a much more revealing emotion in a villain than simple greed ever is. The child is snatched up to safety, the dragon misses his one chance, and the scene hard cuts to open war breaking out in the heavens. Michael and his angels on one side of the line, the dragon and his forces on the other, and the dragon loses, not narrowly, not on a technicality. He is thrown down and out, named plainly as the ancient serpent, the accuser, the one who deceives the entire world, hurled out of the place he most wanted to rule. This is the fall that quietly sits underneath every other event in the story. Not a close match he was unlucky to drop. A total humiliating eviction, the kind you do not come back from and do not stop resenting. Now, a normal defeated general, having lost the war that actually counted, might reasonably retire. Take up a hobby. Reflect perhaps on some of the choices that led him to this point. This one does no such thing. Having lost decisively where it truly mattered, he simply picks up the entire war and relocates it. If he cannot win in the heavens, he will drag the fight down to the ground, to the one arena still up for grabs, and he arrives carrying a very specific flavour of rage, because, as the text carefully notes, he knows his time is short. There is nothing quite like a looming deadline to concentrate a grudge into something genuinely dangerous, and notice the weapon he reaches for, because it is not the one you would expect from something this powerful. He is named, over and over again, the deceiver. Not the destroyer first, not the brute, but the liar. His real strength was never raw force, which he already tried once and lost with rather badly. His strength is persuasion, illusion, the careful arrangement of appearances so that people walk willingly toward the very thing that will undo them, often thanking him warmly the whole way there. That single fact should quietly change what you watch for in everything ahead. The danger will almost never announce itself as danger. It will arrive dressed as relief, as common sense, as the obvious and reasonable choice that only a paranoid crank would think to question. A thing that fights with lies does not need you to surrender. It only needs you to believe. But here is the single detail that changes how you read absolutely everything that follows, and it is astonishingly easy to miss precisely because it is so counterintuitive. His core goal is not at bottom destruction. Destruction is simply the mood he happens to be in on the way to the real objective. His actual ambition is far stranger, far more revealing, and weirdly personal. He wants to be worshipped. He reached for the throne, he lost the throne, and rather than let the dream die, he decides to counterfeit it instead. If he cannot be God, then he will build the most convincing possible replica and see whether anyone in the audience is sharp enough to spot the difference. That one decision is the engine driving this whole machine. It explains why the coming figure is not going to behave like an ordinary conqueror. Ordinary conquerors want the usual shopping list: land and gold and power and a statue or two in a nice square. This one is chasing something far weirder. He's trying to reproduce, beat for beat, the life of the very person he hates the most. He wants a messiah of his own making, a mirror image, a precise reversal of the genuine article. And because a mirror image looks nearly identical while pointing in the exact opposite direction, it is the single most dangerous species of forgery that exists. Envy, when it gets this large, stops trying to destroy the thing it hates and starts trying to become it, which is somehow worse. Once you actually see that, the entire future snaps into place with an almost mathematical tidiness. Every major beat of the true story is going to get its own knockoff edition. The real saviour had a miraculous arrival, so the counterfeit will engineer a miraculous arrival of his own. The real saviour died and rose again, so the counterfeit will stage a death and a resurrection, special effects included. The real saviour offered a kingdom of peace, so the counterfeit will roll out a shiny kingdom of peace, complete with a signing ceremony and probably a commemorative pen. The dragon, inconveniently for the rest of us, has read the source material with the fixated attention of an obsessive fan. He's not improvising any of this. He's constructing a forgery directly off the original blueprints, and he has had an almost unimaginable amount of time to study them line by line. This is exactly why it is a mistake, a comforting mistake, but a genuinely dangerous one, to picture the coming figure as merely another tyrant who happens to land a little worse than the previous model. He is not the next unfortunate name on a long list of bad men. He is the finished product of a design, a spiritual operation running a strategy older than any surviving record. In this framework, every villain you have ever read about was in a sense a rough draft, a test print. He is the final version they were all, without ever knowing it, rehearsing for. There is one oddly hopeful thing buried in all of this dread, and it is worth naming before we move on, because it is easy to walk right past in the gloom. A forgery only exists because there is something real worth forging. Nobody counterfeits a currency that has no value. Nobody bothers building an elaborate imitation of a thing that does not matter to anyone. The very existence of a counterfeit messiah, this much effort, this much strategy, this many centuries of patient planning, is itself a strange backhanded testimony that the genuine article is real and worth every ounce of the imitation. The dragon, in his own furious and joyless way, is paying the highest compliment he possibly can to the one he cannot stand. Nobody works this hard to copy something that was not, deep down, the single most valuable thing there is. There is one more piece to quietly plant here before we drop back down to earth, and we are only going to plant it, not dig into it, because it does not fully bloom until much later. The forgery does not stop at a single counterfeit messiah. The design is far more ambitious than one lonely impostor. It reaches for a complete imitation of the divine, a three-part parody in which every role has a carefully cast stand-in. A false father, working the controls from the shadows and never quite stepping into the light. A false saviour, front and centre, soaking up all the applause. And a false spirit whose entire job is to aim the crowd at the impostor and convince them, sincerely and enthusiastically, that they are looking at the real thing. An anti-trinity, if you want a name for it, though we will properly earn that phrase later, once the third member finally strolls on stage and starts doing tricks. For now, just tuck it away somewhere safe. The counterfeit is not a solo act. It is an entire fraudulent institution, and it comes fully staffed. So the war did not begin with humanity, and it will not be settled by any of humanity's usual weapons. The dragon has a plan, a target, and a template. What he still lacks is an earthly stage large enough to run the con on a properly global scale. And that stage, as luck would have it, already exists. It already has a throne, it already has a rider, and it is thoroughly, smugly convinced that it is the one holding the reins. So come back down to the ground now, because before the main figure can rise, the pieces on the board have to be set, and Revelation lays out that arrangement in an image nobody who reads it ever fully shakes off. A woman, draped in purple and scarlet, dripping with gold and pearls, holding up a jewelled cup, seated on the back of a monstrous scarlet beast that is smeared with blasphemous names and sporting 7 heads and 10 horns. It is grotesque and glamorous in the very same breath. which happens to be the entire point rather than an accident of the description. This woman is not a person. She is a system, and the text does not bother to hide it. It calls her a great harlot, and the imagery is intentionally unflattering, but if you strip away the ancient shock value, what she stands for is uncomfortably familiar. She's a portrait of a global order built on wealth, appetite, and consumption without any off-switch. She lives on luxury, thrives on trade, and has grown obscenely rich by selling the world absolutely everything it craves and none of what it actually needs. In the popular reading, she is the glittering, materialistic, morally worn-out engine of modern commerce, the culture that prices everything down to the last cent and forgets, somewhere along the way, to ask what any of it is actually worth. She is not evil in a dramatic cape-swishing way. She is evil in a comfortable way, the kind that turns up in very expensive shoes and genuinely believes it is the good guy in the room. Look closely at that jeweled cup in her hand, because it is doing more work than it seems. She's not merely rich for her own private benefit. She is in the business of getting others intoxicated too, passing the cup around, pulling the rest of the world into the same appetite until whole nations are drunk on the things she is selling. That is how a system like this actually spreads. Not by force, at least not at first, but by making its particular kind of excess feel normal, then feel necessary, then feel like the only sane way to live. By the time anyone sobers up enough to ask hard questions, they are already dependent on the very thing that owns them, and her reach does not stay politely contained to some distant capital, where the very rich amuse themselves out of sight. That is the part almost everyone underestimates. A system like this works by threading itself quietly through everyone's ordinary life, until countless people, who would never dream of calling themselves powerful, are nonetheless completely dependent on it staying upright. The goods on the shelves, the numbers in the accounts, the small comforts everyone stopped noticing years ago because they feel as permanent as gravity, all of it runs through her in one way or another, which means her survival is not somebody else's problem playing out safely far away. It is quietly wired into the daily existence of nearly everyone who ever accepted the cup, whether they remember accepting it or not. That invisible web is going to matter enormously later, so it is worth spotting now while it still looks completely harmless. And crucially, she is not sitting on a throne of her own making. That is the whole tension coiled inside the image. She is sitting on the beast. The creature beneath her represents raw force, a coalition of nations, the military and political muscle that lets her keep living the way she lives. She supplies the money and the appetite. It supplies the power. And for a good long while, the arrangement suits everybody involved. She gets to indulge, the beast gets to feel useful, and neither party looks too closely at where exactly this partnership is heading. Looking too closely would spoil the mood, and the mood is expensive to maintain. Here is where her fatal miscalculation is hiding, and it is precisely the kind of error that powerful, comfortable people make with almost supernatural reliability. She's convinced she is the rider. She believes, right down to her bones, that she is the one steering, directing the beast wherever she pleases, because after all she is the one with the wealth, and wealth has always purchased obedience before, so why would this time be any different? What she has conveniently managed to forget is that the thing underneath her is not a trained horse. It is a predator. It is tolerating her, not serving her, and there is an enormous difference between those two words that tends to reveal itself at the worst possible moment. A predator carries its passenger for exactly as long as the ride stays convenient, and not 1 second longer. There is also a quieter fragility here, one worth noticing before it matters. A fortune this size looks permanent, unshakable, carved into the bedrock. But wealth on this scale does not actually rest on gold in a vault. It rests on confidence, on everybody involved agreeing to keep believing the numbers mean something. And confidence, unlike stone, can evaporate overnight. A system that took generations to build can rest, at the end of the day, on nothing sturdier than a shared mood, which is a genuinely alarming foundation for something that considers itself the most powerful force on Earth. Stranger still is the one thing this kind of system simply cannot do, no matter how clever the people running it happen to be. It cannot imagine its own ending. A power that has run the world for as long as anyone can remember develops a deep, unspoken certainty that it always will, that tomorrow is guaranteed to look basically like today, only with slightly newer toys. Every empire in history has carried that exact blind spot right up until the afternoon it discovered otherwise. usually looking genuinely astonished, as if permanence had been promised to it somewhere in writing. The harlot has that same blindness in its purest, most concentrated form. She has grown so accustomed to winning that the mere idea of falling has become literally unthinkable to her, and a thing you refuse to even think about is, reliably, the exact thing you will never see coming. Those 7 heads and 10 horns are not just decorative flourishes either. The 10 horns, the text says outright, are 10 kings, 10 rulers who have not yet fully shown their hand, biding their time in the wings for the right moment to walk out. For now they lend their combined strength to the whole structure, propping up the system that in turn props up the woman on its back. But borrowed loyalty is a famously unstable currency, and these are not sentimental men prone to gratitude. They are doing quiet arithmetic. The harlot looks down at them and sees loyal supporters, maybe even friends. They look up at her and see a spectacularly rich meal that simply has not been served yet. So the picture that finally comes into focus is not a stable empire at all. It is a slow-motion betrayal wearing the costume of an alliance. The weapon is beginning to resent the hand that keeps swinging it. The beast that carries the woman is starting, very quietly, to sharpen its teeth and think its own private thoughts. And the reason all of this matters so intensely for everything still to come is that it completely rearranges your sense of who the victims of this story are actually going to be. Because the natural instinct, the assumption almost everyone brings in by default, is that the rich and the powerful are the safe ones. They are always the last to fall in the movies, the characters with the bunkers and the private jets, and the escape routes mapped out 3 moves ahead. But this story cheerfully flips that instinct upside down. In this framework, the wealthy, comfortable, world-running system is not the final boss standing guard at the end of the level. It is the first casualty, the opening kill. The harlot is not perched safely at the very top of the pyramid. She is perched on top of a trap that simply has not sprung yet, sipping contentedly from her golden cup, utterly certain she is the most secure person in the entire room, which is very often the exact moment the floor decides to open beneath someone. One honest word of caution before we move on, because skipping it would be irresponsible. Everything in this section is an interpretation of symbols, not a literal map with real names and coordinates printed helpfully in the margins. These images have been read 100 different ways across the centuries, and thoughtful people have confidently pointed the finger at wildly different empires, cities, and institutions, depending mostly on which century they happen to be standing in when they read it. The goal here is not to pin a modern flag onto an ancient woman and declare the mystery solved. The goal is the pattern, because the pattern is the part that keeps repeating no matter which era you are in. A dazzling system, drunk on its own success, absolutely certain it is in control, riding along on top of a power that is only waiting for the right moment to buck it off and finish the job. And that, at last, is the board fully set. A world exhausted and aching for order. A defeated spirit with a patient plan to counterfeit heaven itself. And a gilded, self-satisfied system convinced it grips the reins tightly, while the real predator waits, entirely unbothered, underneath. Every player is in position, every motive is quietly loaded, and only one question is still hanging in the air. Where does the rider go when the beast finally decides it is done being ridden, and who exactly steps forward to seize the reins that the harlot, for all her gold, was never actually holding? The answer, when it finally steps out of the crowd, is almost insulting in how unremarkable it looks. You have been picturing the great enemy of everything, the culmination of a plan older than writing itself, and you have probably been picturing something enormous. A towering figure, a booming voice, an entrance with its own weather. What the old texts actually hand you is the least impressive person in the room. Go back to the prophet Daniel, centuries before any of the rest of this, wrestling with a vision he does not enjoy and does not fully understand. He watches a run of beasts, each one a kingdom, and the last of them sprouts a cluster of horns, 10 of them, the same 10 rulers we already met idling in the wings, and then, while he is watching, something small begins pushing its way up among them. A little horn. Not a great one, not a proud one, at least not yet. The smallest, newest, most easily overlooked growth on the entire animal, the kind of thing you would not notice unless someone pointed it out, and possibly not even then. That smallness is not a throwaway detail. It is the whole strategy, announced in advance and promptly ignored by everyone in the story, which is exactly why it keeps working. Nobody keeps an eye on the least significant player at the table. Nobody wastes suspicion on the man who seems to want nothing, threatens no one, and asks only for a modest seat near the back. Every other power in the room is far too busy watching the obvious threats, the loud ones, the rich ones, the ones with visible armies. The little horn simply waits quietly, while the big personalities exhaust themselves glaring at one another. It is the oldest trick there is, and the book apparently was written specifically about him. There is a quiet and rather unsettling lesson tucked inside that smallness. We tend to expect great evil to announce itself. We imagine it will have the decency to look the part, to be obviously monstrous, so that we can all recognize it and refuse it in good time. History, and this text right along with it, keeps insisting on the opposite. The most dangerous things almost never arrive wearing a warning label. They come in small, reasonable, welcome shapes. Through doors we hold open ourselves, and by the time they have grown large enough to frighten us, we have already spent years getting comfortable with them. A little horn is not scary. That is precisely the problem. Nothing that starts out scary ever gets the chance to grow. There is a bitter irony in that smallness too, one that only lands if you remember the story he is imitating. The one he is counterfeiting also arrived without armies, also came in a form the powerful overlooked, also entered the world through the back door rather than the palace gate. In that original story, genuine greatness looked like humility because it actually was humility, a real lowering of oneself for the sake of others. He has noticed this, and so he copies the posture down to the last detail while quietly hollowing out everything that made it good. He wears humility the way a hunter wears camouflage, not because he is humble, but because looking harmless is simply the most efficient way to get close enough to strike. The lowly entrance is not a contradiction of his pride. It is his pride in disguise playing a very long game. Daniel notices one thing about this little horn that sets it apart from ordinary ambition, and it is a genuinely strange detail. This horn has eyes like a man and a mouth speaking great things. In other words, it is not merely a political force. It is a person, a face, an individual with a gaze and a voice, and behind that ordinary human exterior is something that does not feel ordinary at all. The imagery is deliberately doubled. On the surface, a man you could pass on the street without a second glance. Underneath, something staring out through his eyes that has been staring for a very, very long time. And that is where a second thread braids into the picture, and the temperature of the whole thing drops a few degrees. Alongside the human figure, the text keeps describing a beast that comes up out of the abyss, the bottomless pit, a thing that rises from somewhere underneath the world rather than being born into it like everyone else. Lay the two images side by side and the meaning that emerges is easy to state and hard to shake. The man is real. He is a genuine human being who eats and sleeps and shakes hands and gives speeches. But he is also a mask. There is a passenger. The person the world will come to adore is a costume worn by something far older than the person inside it. It is worth pausing on where exactly this passenger is said to come from, because the direction is not an accident. He does not descend from above, the way the genuine article did. He rises from below, up out of the abyss, the pit, the deep place underneath everything. In the geography of these old texts, up and down are never merely up and down. They are moral directions, and everything about him is arising from the wrong one. He is, quite literally, an inversion, a figure climbing up from the opposite end of the map to occupy a throne he was never meant to reach. Even his arrival is upside down, a counterfeit of a descent, and if you are paying close attention, that mismatch is the first quiet clue that the saviour everyone is about to celebrate came in through the cellar rather than the sky. It is worth being careful about what that mask actually means, because it would be easy to slide into cartoon territory, and the text is more subtle than a horror movie. This is not a puppet with a hand up its back, a hollow man with no will of his own. He is a real person with real ambitions, real intelligence, real charm, all of it authentically his. The point is not that the man is empty. The point is that his own hunger for power lines up so perfectly with the older hunger driving him that the two become impossible to pry apart, each feeding the other until you cannot tell where the human ambition ends and the ancient one begins. He is not being forced. He is being amplified. That is a far more disturbing arrangement than simple possession, because it means every terrible thing he does willingly, wanting it, convinced it was his own idea from the very start. Remember the ancient loser from earlier? the one who lost the war that actually mattered and relocated the fight down here rather than accept defeat gracefully. This is where all that patience finally cashes out. The spirit driving the coming figure did not begin getting ready last year, or last decade, or last century. By the framework these texts lay out, it has been preparing for this precise role since before there was any human civilization to run it in. That is a genuinely heavy thing to sit with. Every tyrant you have ever read about was improvising. This one has been rehearsing since the beginning of everything. Now set him next to the woman on the beast, because the contrast is the entire reason for introducing him here. She had everything he lacks and none of the one thing he has. She had the wealth, the luxury, the appetite, the reach, the golden cup passed around to the nations. What she did not have, as we saw, was the faintest idea how to actually control the predator she was riding. She mistook sitting on top of something for steering it, a mistake that feels perfectly comfortable right up until the animal decides otherwise. He is her opposite in every way that counts. He arrives with essentially nothing. No fortune, no glittering empire, no dazzling excess to seduce anyone with. His toolkit is almost boringly austere by comparison. What he brings instead is a cold, patient, surgical intelligence, and standing behind that intelligence, the supernatural backing we have been circling this whole time. His power is not that he can outspend his rivals or outparty them. His power is that he can outthink all of them at once, that he understands exactly how to handle the beast the harlot never learned to manage, and that he is not, at bottom, working alone. Money buys comfort. Appetite buys distraction. Neither of them buys a predator that stays loyal. He has something that does. It helps, of course, that he shows up at the perfect moment, which is not really a coincidence so much as the whole reason the timing was set up earlier. He arrives into that exhausted, order-hungry world we already described and simply confirms what the crowd was already desperate to believe. The most effective con in history is the one where the mark does most of the work, and this particular audience has been volunteering for months. Here is the part worth slowing right down on, because it is where the horror actually lives, and it is not where most people expect to find it. He is not a raving lunatic frothing about domination. If he were, he would be easy to spot, easy to reject, and this whole story would be a great deal shorter and considerably happier. Instead, he is charming, reasonable, impressively, disarmingly calm. He is the man who walks into a tense room and somehow lowers everyone's blood pressure, who says the sensible thing while everyone else is shouting, who seems above all else safe. His ruthlessness never announces itself. It wears the face of moderation, and that is precisely what makes him more dangerous than any snarling conqueror could ever hope to be, because you simply do not raise your defenses against the person who makes you feel calm. Charisma is the word we usually reach for, but that word is far too gentle for what is actually happening. Real charisma is not merely likability. It is the strange, almost physical ability to make other people stop thinking for themselves and start borrowing your certainty instead. And in an anxious world, borrowed certainty is the most seductive thing on the entire menu. He does not need to win arguments. He simply needs to be the calmest, most assured presence in every room and let the sheer gravity of that assurance do the persuading. People follow confidence over competence nearly every time, and they follow it especially hard when they are afraid, because confidence feels like a promise that someone at last knows what they are doing. He has an endless supply of it, and unlike almost everyone around him, he never once has to fake it. It is tempting to file him under the familiar heading of politician, the ambitious operator who says whatever a crowd wants to hear, and that instinct will lead you badly astray. Every tool we normally use to size up a leader is going to give a false reading on this one. We look for the seams in a politician, the gap between the promise and the record, the little tell that reveals the self-interest hiding under the smile. He has no visible seams because the performance goes all the way down. We reassure ourselves that power corrupts, that a man who gains this much will surely overreach and stumble in time, and ordinarily we would be right. But he did not become like this on the way up. He arrived already finished, already precisely what he is, with nothing left to corrupt and no naive earlier version for success to spoil. Judging him by the yardsticks that work on ordinary ambition is a bit like trying to measure the ocean with a ruler. The instrument is not wrong, it is simply far too small for the thing standing in front of it. Which brings us to the question of scale, and here the temptation is to reach for the usual comparisons, the names history hands us whenever it wants to describe a monster. But every one of those comparisons falls short, and the falling short is the point. He is not another Napoleon, hungry for a map with his own name printed across it. He is not even the worst figures of the last century, the ones whose names people still lower their voices to say aloud. In the logic of these texts, all of those men were echoes, faint, partial, early sketches of a design that had not yet been fully drawn. Without ever knowing it, they borrowed from the same source he answers to directly. He is not the next name on that grim list. He is the thing the whole list was faintly imitating all along, the original pattern that every tyrant since has been an unwitting cover version of. Sit with that scale for a moment, because most of what follows only makes sense once you feel the size of it. So we have him now. We know what he is, who stands behind him, why he's arriving at exactly this moment, and why he is so much more frightening as a calm man than he ever would be as a raging one. What we do not yet know is the single most interesting thing about him, the thing that separates him from every loud tyrant who ever tried to take the world by kicking the door down. We do not yet know how someone this small, this unremarkable, this apparently harmless, actually claws his way to the top of a coalition of hardened kings who did not exactly get where they are by being naive. That is not a story of armies. It is a story of manipulation so precise it barely leaves fingerprints. Because the truly remarkable thing about the Little Horn's rise is what is missing from it. There is no grand invasion, no thundering war of conquest, no dramatic clash where the biggest army wins and the credits roll. That would be far too crude, and crude is simply not his style. What actually happens is quieter, colder, and considerably more clever, which is also considerably more chilling once you understand how it works. Daniel's vision hands us the mechanic in a single, almost offhand image. Among the 10 horns, 3 are plucked up by the roots before the little one, uprooted to make room for it. 3 of the 10 rulers, in other words, are removed, and the way you should picture that removal is the important part. This is not 3 kingdoms crushed on a battlefield in front of cheering crowds. This is 3 powerful men who one by one quietly stop being a problem. A sudden fall from favour over here. An alliance that collapses at a suspiciously convenient moment over there. A scandal, a betrayal, a partnership that curdles overnight, a rival who overreaches and is gently permitted to destroy himself. By the time anyone thinks to add it all up, 3 of the 10 thrones are simply empty, and nobody can quite reconstruct how it happened or point to the exact moment things went wrong. If you want to understand why this method beats open warfare so badly, consider what open warfare actually costs. A conqueror who takes a throne by force makes an enemy of everyone who loved the previous occupant, spends lives and treasure doing it, and leaves behind a population that knows precisely who to blame and spends the next generation quietly plotting revenge. A man who simply arranges for a throne to become vacant pays almost none of those bills. There is no obvious aggressor to hate, no battlefield to mourn, no clear moment when a crime even occurred. The victim usually looks like the author of his own downfall, having apparently stumbled into ruin through his own bad luck or bad judgment. It is the perfect murder scaled up to the level of nations, and its crowning achievement is that afterward, nobody is entirely certain a murder ever took place. Notice too what he does not do, because the restraint is every bit as telling as the ambition. He does not wipe out the whole coalition and start over with people loyal to him alone, which a cruder tyrant would almost certainly have tried. He needs the beast whole. A predator with 3 legs missing is no use to a man who intends to ride it into a far larger war, and rebuilding the thing from scratch would cost him the one resource he guards most jealously, which is time. So he removes only what he must, exactly 3 and not 1 more, and leaves the rest of the machine intact and running, simply with his own hand now resting on the controls. It is the difference between a wrecker and an operator. He has no interest in rubble. He wants a working engine that answers to him, and he has just acquired one at a fraction of the usual price. This is where being underestimated stops being a disadvantage and becomes the sharpest weapon in his possession. A powerful man is watched. A dangerous man is guarded against. But a small, agreeable, seemingly minor player is invited into rooms he should never be allowed near, handed information he should never see, and trusted with tasks nobody bothers to guard. Each of the great kings looks at him and makes the very same fatal calculation the harlot made about her beast. Each one decides that he is useful, that he can be aimed at a rival and then quietly discarded, that surely a man this modest can be managed. Every one of them intends to use him. Not a single one of them notices that being used is exactly what he came for, because a tool ends up going wherever it likes once everyone has agreed to pass it around freely. He does not so much defeat the three strong kings as arrange for them to defeat one another, standing just off to the side wearing an expression of polite concern while the dominoes he set up weeks earlier finish falling on schedule. It is patient, unglamorous work, the kind that never inspires a heroic painting, and it is devastating precisely because nobody can ever prove it was happening. There is no single villainous act to point at, no smoking weapon left on the table, just a long string of unfortunate events that all, somehow, break in exactly one man's favour. Coincidence, everyone agrees with a nervous laugh, has been remarkably generous to him lately. Then comes the moment the remaining 7 finally understand what they are looking at. There is no dramatic showdown, no last stand. There rarely is with men like these, because men who claw their way to the top of nations are, above everything else, survivors, and survivors are exceptionally good at reading which way the wind has just turned. One by one, the 7 surviving kings study the empty thrones where 3 of their peers used to sit, do the arithmetic, and arrive at the only sensible conclusion available to them. Whoever arranged this is not a man to oppose, he is a man to stand behind quickly before the offer expires. So they bend the knee, not out of love and certainly not out of trust, but out of the crisp, unsentimental instinct for self-preservation that earned them their crowns in the first place. Better to be his ally than his next unfortunate coincidence. But here is the detail that separates a mere schemer from a genuine master, and it is the reason the 7 do not simply resent him and wait for a chance to strike back. He does not only frighten them into line, he bribes them, in the deeper sense of the word, by offering each one precisely the thing he has secretly wanted for years. This is where the cold intelligence pays its richest dividend. He has studied these men the way he studies everything, patiently and without mercy, until he knows the private hunger buried under every single crown. The one who craves respect is offered respect. The one who craves revenge is offered revenge. The one who craves security or territory, or simply to outlive the rivals who have mocked him, is offered exactly that, gift-wrapped and delivered as though it had been his own idea all along. And this is why his grip on the 7 is so much firmer than fear alone could ever make it. Loyalty bought with terror is loyalty that spends every waking hour hunting for the exit. Frighten a man into obedience, and you have manufactured a lifelong enemy who is merely biding his time, waiting for the one moment your back is turned. But loyalty bought by handing a man the exact thing his heart has been quietly starving for is a different and far sturdier animal. Those 7 kings do not follow him only because they are afraid of becoming the next empty throne, though they certainly are afraid of that. They follow him because for the first time in their long and disappointed careers, somebody has finally given them what they actually wanted, and gratitude of that particular kind, especially in men unused to receiving any, binds tighter than any chain ever forged. He has not merely cornered them, he has made them feel understood, which is a far more powerful trick than intimidation, and considerably harder to undo. The grandest prize of all, the one dangled in front of every one of them at once, is the very thing this whole arrangement has been quietly building toward. He offers them freedom from the woman on the beast. Remember, these kings have spent their entire careers propping up a system that treated them as muscle and nothing more, lending their strength to the glittering order that lived off their labour while looking down its nose at them. They have carried the harlot on their backs for a very long time, resenting every mile of it. And now, at last, someone has arrived who not only sees that resentment, but promises to end it, to hand them the deep satisfaction of throwing off the passenger they never chose to carry. To men who have spent decades being used as a mount, the promise of finally bucking the rider is not a dry policy proposal. It is the fulfillment of a grudge, and grudges, it turns out, are the most loyal customers there are, so the transfer is complete, and it happened almost without anyone raising a sword. The coalition the woman believed she commanded now answers to him instead. The reins she thought were resting in her manicured hands, the reins she was in fact never truly holding, have quietly slid into the grip of the one man in the entire story who actually knows how to use them. He is now the head of the beast, the master of the predator, the leader of the very coalition built to serve someone else entirely, and the woman, still sipping contentedly from her golden cup, has not yet noticed that the animal beneath her has taken on a new driver, and that the new driver does not like her in the slightest. And from the outside, from the vantage point of the ordinary watching world, none of this looks the least bit sinister. That is the genuinely clever part. The average person does not see a spider patiently clearing rivals off its web. They see a fractured, squabbling collection of nations somehow, almost miraculously, coming together under a single steady hand. They see cooperation where there was chaos, agreement where there was deadlock, a rising figure who accomplishes in a matter of months what tired institutions failed to manage in decades. To them it reads not as a hostile takeover, but as a long overdue breath of competence, and they are deeply grateful for it. Every dark maneuver we have just walked through is, from the public balcony, completely invisible. What the crowd applauds is the one thing it has been begging for all along, a leader who can finally get things done. They have no idea what he intends to do with all that goodwill once he has finished quietly collecting it. You might expect him to turn on the woman immediately now, to spend that fresh power at once on the single target this entire scheme was designed to reach. And he wants to. But he is nothing if not disciplined, and a disciplined man does not start a war in his living room while the kitchen is quietly catching fire. Before he can afford to move against the woman and her wealth, there is a problem sitting on his own doorstep, one that has humbled every conqueror who ever tried to solve it, one that has been smouldering, flaring, and stubbornly refusing to be put out for thousands of years. To grasp why even he, with all his patience and all his hidden backing, treats this one region as the obstacle worth handling before anything else, you have to appreciate just how thoroughly it has broken everyone who came before him. This is the ground where the greatest empires of history came to overextend themselves and quietly begin their long decline. Conquerors far louder than him marched in supremely confident, and marched out, if they marched out at all, having learned an expensive lesson about the limits of raw force. The rivalries here are not measured in years or even in lifetimes, but in millennia. Ancient grievances handed down through so many generations that the original insult has long since been forgotten, while the resentment burns on, undimmed and untiring. It is the single most difficult knot on the entire planet, and it has stayed knotted precisely because everyone who ever tried to cut it only managed to pull it tighter. So before he can strike at the old order, he has to do the one thing no one in all of recorded history has ever managed for longer than a fragile, fleeting moment. He has to bring peace to the Middle East. He looks at that impossible tangle and sees, where everyone else only ever saw a graveyard of ambitions, the perfect stage for a miracle, because a man who wants to be mistaken for a saviour needs, more than anything else in the world, an impossible problem to solve in front of a watching audience. And the way he chooses to solve this one will turn out to be the most brilliant and the most catastrophic move of his entire career. And here is the thing every previous would-be peacemaker got badly wrong about that impossible region. The single mistake that turned each of their grand plans into another quiet entry in the graveyard. They all treated it as a political problem. They arrived with maps, borders, trade deals, carefully worded documents, and the touching belief that if you just got the paperwork right, the fighting would finally stop. It never did. Because the divisions there were never really about lines on a map. They run down into something far deeper and far more stubborn than politics has ever managed to reach. They are at the root religious, and religion is the one thing a treaty cannot negotiate away. He understands this perfectly, which is exactly why he is going to succeed where everyone louder and better funded than him has failed. You cannot argue a person out of a conviction they hold in their soul. You cannot bribe away a belief that has been passed down carefully for 100 generations. There is only one thing on earth with enough force to reach that deep and rearrange what it finds there, and it is not a policy. It is a miracle. If you want to unite people who have been killing each other over heaven for millennia, you do not need a better argument. You need a sign from heaven itself, something so undeniable that the old objections simply evaporate in front of it. And to produce a miracle, you need someone capable of performing one. It is worth dwelling for a moment on why belief is so much harder to move than mere interest, because it explains the entire strategy that follows. You can negotiate with a person's interests. Interests are flexible, tradable, open to compromise, which is why most conflicts in the world eventually end at a table once everyone gets tired and hungry enough. But a conviction about the eternal, about who God is and what he demands, does not sit at that table. It cannot be split down the middle or settled with a handshake. Ask a person to trade away half their salary, and they will haggle all afternoon. ask them to trade away half their soul, and the conversation is simply over. That is the wall every peacemaker slammed straight into, and it is a wall you cannot climb with arguments. You can only get over it with something that feels bigger than the belief itself. Enter the second beast. Revelation, having already introduced the first beast rising up out of the sea, now brings a second one onto the stage, and this one comes from somewhere entirely different. It comes up out of the earth. The distinction matters more than it first appears. The first came from the deep, the foreign, the abyss, something alien surfacing from far below. The second is homegrown, terrestrial, familiar, a thing that grows up out of the very ground the people are standing on. It does not feel like an invader. It feels local, native, one of us, which is precisely what makes it so effective at the job it is about to do. And then comes the detail that tells you everything, delivered in the compact, almost offhand way these old texts specialize in. This second beast has 2 horns like a lamb, but it speaks like a dragon. Sit with that image for a second, because it is one of the most efficient descriptions of a con artist ever committed to writing. On the outside, gentleness itself, soft, meek, harmless, wearing the appearance of the most innocent creature imaginable, the very picture of a shepherd rather than a predator. But the moment it opens its mouth, out comes the voice of the dragon we have been tracking this whole time. The costume is a lamb. The words are pure serpent. It looks like Faith and sounds, if you actually listen closely, exactly like the thing Faith was supposed to protect people from. That lamb costume is not a minor accessory. It is the whole reason the operation works, and it pairs perfectly with the fact that this second figure rose up out of familiar ground rather than some distant deep. People brace themselves against the foreign and the threatening. They do not brace themselves against the gentle and the homegrown. A wolf that looks like a wolf gets met with pitchforks. A wolf that looks like a lamb gets invited in, offered a chair, and politely asked its opinion on important matters. By the time anyone realizes the gentle local holy man has been speaking with a borrowed voice this entire time, they have already handed him the keys, and getting the keys back from a dragon is famously difficult. This is the false prophet, and his assignment is one of the stranger jobs in the entire story. He is a religious figure, a spiritual leader, a man draped in all the trappings of holiness. But unlike every genuine prophet who ever pointed people toward God, his whole purpose is to point people towards someone else. His mission is not to make himself worshipped at all. It is to make the first beast worshipped, to gather up all the awe and reverence and devotion of the human race, and aim it, carefully, at the man he serves. He is the ultimate hype man for a false god, and he is extremely good at what he does. How good? Good enough to call fire down out of the open sky in front of a live audience. That is the headline act, the showstopper the text specifically mentions, and you can picture the effect easily enough. Imagine it from the perspective of an ordinary, exhausted, skeptical person in that crowd, someone who has heard every empty promise 100 times and long since stopped believing any of them. Words they can dismiss, leaders they can ignore. But fire falling from a clear sky on command, witnessed with their own eyes, is a completely different category of thing. It bypasses the arguing part of the brain and goes straight to the part that quietly decides what is real. You do not debate a man who commands the heavens. You simply, quietly, start to believe him. And there is a subtler reason the signs work so well, one that has nothing to do with the spectacle itself. The crowd wants them to be true. We touched on this hunger earlier, the way a frightened world leans into anything offering hope rather than hunting for reasons to doubt it. A miracle gives that hunger precisely what it has been craving, which is permission. It hands people an excuse to stop resisting and start believing, and most of them were only ever waiting for an excuse in the first place. The sign does not really convince the skeptic against his will. It gives the tired, hopeful person the cover he needed to surrender to something he already wanted to surrender to. That is a far easier sale, and the false prophet never wastes effort on the hard version when the easy one is sitting right there. Notice too what the wonders actually accomplish on the ground, because it is more than personal persuasion. A single, undeniable public miracle does something 1,000 years of theological debate never could. It gives rival faiths, bitter enemies for as far back as memory stretches, a reason to stop glaring at each other and start looking in the same direction instead. When the sky itself appears to endorse one man, the fine distinctions people were willing to die over yesterday begin, quietly, to feel a great deal less urgent. The false prophet is not converting anyone in the old patient sense. He's doing something faster and far more dangerous. He's melting 100 quarrelling loyalties down into one, using pure ore as the furnace, and pouring the whole molten mess into a single mold shaped exactly like the man he serves. This is the secret he understands better than any general or banker in the story. People do not, in the end, follow raw power. Raw power frightens them and sends them looking for the exits. What people follow is wonder. Give a crowd a spectacle it cannot explain, wrap authority in the glow of the miraculous, and they will hand over not just their obedience but their hearts, which is a far deeper and far more durable form of control. Money buys compliance, weapons buy fear, only wonder buys worship, and worship is the single currency this whole operation has ever actually cared about. Which finally lets us cash in a promise made much earlier, back when we noted that the counterfeit is never a solo act. Now we can see the full shape of it, and the design is almost elegant in its awfulness. It is a trinity. A dark, deliberate three-part mockery of the real thing, with every role carefully filled by an imposter. At the top, in the shadows, sits the dragon, the ancient loser himself playing the part of a false father. Like the true father he despises, he stays largely unseen, working behind everything, the hidden source from which the whole operation draws its authority. He is the origin, the will, the mind behind the plan, and he almost never steps into the light directly because he does not need to. He has others to do that for him. In the spotlight stands the first beast, the man from the abyss, playing the false son. He is the visible one, the face, the figure who walks among the people and receives their devotion, the counterfeit Messiah we have already spent a great deal of time with. Everything the real one was, he imitates in reverse. He is the image the world sees when it believes it is finally looking at its Saviour, the public figure onto whom all the worship is at last directed. And connecting the two, doing the tireless work of turning hearts and gathering the crowd, is the false prophet, playing the anti-spirit. This is the part that reveals just how carefully the whole thing was designed. The genuine spirit in the original never draws attention to itself either. Its role is to point people toward the Son, to testify about him, to fill and empower and convince. The false prophet performs that exact same job, beat for beat, only aimed at the wrong destination. He testifies, he empowers, he convinces, he draws every eye toward the beast, and he does it with signs and wonders that look, to anyone not watching very closely, precisely like the real article. 3 roles, one monstrous parody, each imposter slotted exactly where a true person ought to be. There is something worth naming about the specific kind of lie the false prophet tells, because it is more sinister than a simple falsehood. Every authentic prophet in the long tradition he is parodying had one defining feature, which is that they pointed away from themselves and away from any human figure, upward, toward God alone. Their entire message was, in effect, do not look at me, look higher. The false prophet does the precise reverse. He takes all that religious machinery, all the language of the sacred, all the weight of the holy, and he uses it to aim people downward, at a man, insisting that this human being standing right in front of them deserves the devotion that was only ever meant for heaven. It is idolatry with excellent production values. The oldest error in the book handed a spectacular new marketing campaign, and it works because it wears the exact uniform of the truth it is inverting. What you're really watching once both beasts are on the stage together is a perfect division of labour. The first beast supplies the power, the throne, the sheer worldly authority, everything that makes a kingdom actually run. The second supplies the meaning, the reverence, the sense that this authority is not merely permitted but ordained, blessed, holy. One holds the sword and the other holds the incense, and between them they cover the only 2 things a ruler truly needs to become impossible to overthrow. A man with power but no legitimacy is just a tyrant waiting to be toppled. A man with legitimacy but no power is just a preacher waiting to be ignored. Put the 2 together in a single cause, pointing at a single figure, and you have built something that grips people by both the throat and the heart at once, which is a genuinely hard grip to pry loose. So the false prophet is, in the plainest possible terms, a propaganda machine, but a propaganda machine that traffics in the supernatural, which makes it more persuasive than any newspaper, broadcast or army ever assembled. He takes naked ambition and gives it a halo. And this is the tool, far more than the armies and far more than the money, that finally accomplishes the impossible. This is how the man unites a region that stayed divided through every empire that ever tried to hold it. Not by resolving the ancient quarrels, but by rising above them, by producing a figure so wrapped in wonder that the old lines start to blur and the old hatreds start to feel small and petty. Spiritual seduction succeeds precisely where politics and force always failed, because it reaches the one place they never could. It goes straight for the soul, and once you have someone's soul, their vote and their loyalty come free in the same package. With the false prophet at his side and the heavens apparently on his payroll, the man is finally ready to make the move his whole rise has been building toward, the single master stroke that will make the entire watching world fall in love with him overnight. That master stroke is not a battle, it is a signature. After everything, the moment that changes the world turns out to be not a conquest at all, but a piece of paper, which is either deeply anticlimactic or deeply appropriate for a man who has always preferred cleverness to force. The old prophecy in Daniel describes it in a single dense line. A covenant, it says, is confirmed with many for 1 week. And that word, week, is doing something specific that is very easy to miss. In the symbolic arithmetic of these texts, a week here does not mean 7 days. It means 7 years, a set of 7, and this particular set of 7 is the single most important stretch of time in the entire story. Everything from this point forward is measured against this one clock, so it is worth planting a small flag right here. 7 years. Remember that number, and remember above all that it has a middle. What the man actually does is broker the one deal nobody in history has ever managed to keep. He arranges a comprehensive peace between Israel and the nations that have surrounded and opposed it, a full and formal treaty guaranteeing security to a people who have not truly known it for as long as anyone can remember. On its own, that alone would be the diplomatic achievement of the age. But he goes further, and the extra clause is the one that sends a specific and very old hope surging violently back to life. As part of the arrangement, the Jewish people are permitted to rebuild their temple in Jerusalem and to resume the ancient sacrifices to their God on the very ground where it all once stood. To grasp what that means to the people receiving it, you have to understand that this is not some minor administrative permit being stamped. This is the fulfillment of a longing carried faithfully across a staggering span of centuries, a dream prayed over by countless generations who lived and died without ever glimpsing it. And now a single man has simply handed it to them, gift-wrapped, as though it were the easiest thing in the world to arrange. Imagine how that lands. Imagine the gratitude, the disbelief, the tears of people watching a hope older than their nation finally come true in real time. The man who did this does not look like a politician who negotiated a clever settlement. He looks like the answer to a prayer that has been rising unanswered for thousands of years, which is, of course, exactly the point and exactly the trap. Because everything about this piece is real, except the one thing that matters most. The calm is genuine, the rebuilt temple is genuine, the absence of war is genuine. What is not genuine is the foundation the whole thing rests on. This piece is not built on any true reconciliation between ancient enemies, no healing of the wounds, no resolution of the hatreds that fueled the fighting for millennia. It is built entirely on one man. It balances on his personality, his guarantees, his presence, like an enormous structure resting on a single supporting column. And a piece that depends on one person is only ever as trustworthy as that person turns out to be, which, given who we are actually talking about, is a detail the celebrating crowds really ought to be examining a great deal more closely than they are. A structure resting on a single column has one catastrophic property that everyone tends to forget while admiring how tall and impressive it stands. The column does not have to fall for the building to come down. It only has to move. As long as the man holding this piece together wants it to hold, it holds beautifully. But the entire arrangement is now hostage to his intentions, and his intentions are the one variable nobody in the cheering crowd has actually bothered to inspect. They have checked the treaty. They have checked the temple. They have checked everything except the character of the person the whole thing depends on, which is a little like buying a house without ever asking whether the foundation is planning to stay where it is. He can bring the entire magnificent structure down whenever he chooses, not by attacking it, but simply by changing his mind. And changing his mind at precisely the right moment has been the plan from the very beginning. There is a chilling little line tucked into one of the old letters that describes this exact moment with unnerving precision. It warns that when people are saying, with confidence and relief, peace and safety, that is the very moment sudden destruction arrives and catches them completely off guard. It is no accident that the warning targets those specific words. The danger is not loudest when everyone is afraid. The danger is loudest when everyone has just stopped being afraid, when the guard is finally lowered, when the long-awaited calm has arrived and people have exhaled and allowed themselves at last to believe it will hold. That exhale is the sound of the trap springing. Comfort, it turns out, is the perfect cover for catastrophe, because nobody watches the door once they have decided they are finally safe. Look closely at what he has managed to do here, because it is the counterfeit strategy reaching its most brilliant expression yet. He has delivered, point for point, the very things people expected from the genuine Messiah. Peace, where there was endless war. Order, where there was chaos. Hope, where there had been only weary resignation. The real one was supposed to bring exactly these gifts, and here they are arriving right on schedule from the hands of the wrong man entirely. To a world aching for a saviour, and especially to a people who have waited longest of all, he does not merely resemble the answer. He appears in every visible way to be it. And who, honestly, stops to inspect the credentials of the person who just handed them everything they ever wanted? Gratitude is a wonderful thing, but it makes a genuinely terrible security guard. Step back far enough and you can finally see this treaty for what it really is, the crown jewel of a long career built entirely out of convincing forgeries. This counterfeit peace is the most seductive fake of them all, because peace is the one thing every exhausted person on earth desperately wants, and the very last thing any of them are inclined to question when it finally shows up. Each fake was built to make the next one easier to swallow, and this is the last and largest of them, the one that lowers the guard of the entire human race at the exact instant he most needs it lowered. So the world does the only thing it can. It applauds, it celebrates. Israel rejoices, the nations breathe out all at once, and the man is lifted higher than any leader in history has ever been lifted, carried aloft on a wave of relief and adoration so total that disagreeing with him starts to feel almost rude. Nobody sees the catch. Nobody's even looking for one. From where they are all standing, the long nightmare of history has finally ended, and a golden age has begun, and the only reasonable response to a golden age is to relax and enjoy it. But that signature did something else, something completely invisible to the cheering crowds, and it is the reason this single moment matters more than any other so far. It started a clock. The instant the covenant was confirmed, the final 7 years began ticking down, whether anyone in the celebration noticed or not. And here is the part to hold on to as the euphoria settles in. This clock has 2 halves. The first half, 3.5 years of it, is the stretch everyone is about to live through now, and on the surface it will look like absolutely everything they hoped for. Prosperity, stability, the long-promised dawn of peace, a world apparently healed at last. It is worth understanding why he even bothers with a genuinely pleasant first half at all, because a cruder mind would be tempted to skip straight to the domination. But the comfort is not a soft-hearted indulgence on his part, it is load-bearing. Those first 3.5 good years are what make the population utterly dependent on him, woven so deeply into a system of peace and prosperity that they can no longer picture living without it. A people who have grown comfortable are a people with an enormous amount to lose, and a people with an enormous amount to lose are far easier to control than a people who already have nothing left. He is not being generous during the Golden Age, he is fattening the trap. By the time the second half arrives and the terms quietly change, everyone will have far too much invested in him to even consider walking away, which is exactly the position he wanted them in all along. For the ordinary person living through it, this stretch will genuinely feel like the best time to be alive in living memory, which is worth stating plainly, so the horror of what comes next lands the way it should. The wars that once filled every broadcast simply stop. The old anxieties ease, trade flows, cities rebuild, and a generation that grew up braced for the worst finally gets to relax for what feels like the first time. There is nothing fake about their relief, and that is the cruelest part of all. These are not foolish people being obviously duped by an obvious villain. They are reasonable people enjoying a real hard-won calm, with no possible way of knowing that the calm was engineered by the one person who fully intends to take every bit of it back. You cannot really blame them for celebrating. You can only wish that someone had told them to read the fine print, which, as we established a long while ago, is precisely where this sort of thing always lives, because it is the second half that will teach them what they actually signed. The same clever arithmetic that gives us 7 years also drops a precise midpoint dead in the centre of them, and it is at that midpoint, exactly halfway through the Golden Age, that the mask is finally going to come off. Everything constructed during the first 3.5 years exists at bottom to make the second 3.5 impossible to resist. The piece was never the destination, it was the setup. And the number to carry forward from here, the one that will come back utterly transformed the moment the whole thing turns over, is that quiet, patient middle of the 7, where the single greatest bait and switch in the history of the world is already scheduled, already waiting, and already much closer than anyone dancing in the streets could possibly imagine. With the region finally pacified and the entire watching world thoroughly besotted with him, he can at last turn his attention to the one piece of unfinished business this whole long climb was always secretly about. Remember the promise he made to the surviving kings, the grand prize he dangled in front of every one of them at once. He swore he would free them from the woman who had ridden on their backs for generations, the glittering system that lived off their strength while looking down its nose at them. The time has come to make good on that promise, and it turns out he intends to keep it with a thoroughness nobody quite saw coming. There is a line in the old text that states the coming betrayal with almost brutal plainness, and it is worth appreciating how little it bothers to soften the blow. The 10 horns and the beast, it says, will come to hate the woman. They will strip her bare, and they will burn her with fire. That is the whole arrangement, laid out in advance. The predator she believed she was steering, the mount she was so comfortably perched upon, turns on its rider at last. The dog finally rises against its owner. Now, you might reasonably wonder how a system that powerful, that rich, that deeply woven into every corner of the globe could be brought down at all, let alone quickly. Surely a fortune that vast has defences. Surely wealth on that scale amounts to a fortress. And here is where an idea we planted much earlier finally does its damage. As we saw, her fortune never rested on gold in a vault but on borrowed confidence, and confidence, unlike stone, can vanish overnight. Which hands him one glaring weakness that all her gold cannot patch. You do not need to besiege a thing suspended on trust. You only need to make people stop believing. To understand why cutting a single thread brings down the whole web, you have to appreciate just how tangled that web had become. Over the long, comfortable years, every part of the system had been wired into every other part, each fortune leaning on a dozen others, each promise backed by another promise backed by yet another, until the entire structure was less a building than an impossibly elaborate house of cards in which no single card could be removed without the rest deciding to follow it down. That interconnection was sold for generations as strength. Look how unified we all are, the system kept saying. Look how nothing can possibly touch us. It turned out to be the exact opposite. The same wiring that made the system feel invincible was also the perfect delivery mechanism for its collapse. A network built to spread prosperity that worked every bit as efficiently at spreading panic. He did not have to break every card. He only had to flick the right one and let the design finish the job for him. That is precisely the kind of strike he specializes in, and it plays perfectly to the cold, surgical style we have watched him use from the very beginning. He does not need to march armies against her, which would be slow, expensive, and far too obvious. He needs to find the one load-bearing thread in an impossibly complicated web and cut it cleanly, then step back and let the structure do the rest of the work itself. A series of precise strikes, a few well-timed maneuvers behind the scenes, a shove applied at exactly the right pressure point, and the confidence holding the whole thing aloft begins all at once to evaporate. Once that starts, it cannot be stopped, because panic is the one force in economics that moves faster than greed, and greed, as everyone knows, is not exactly slow. And then the world watches something it had genuinely believed was impossible. It watches her fall. The old text does not describe this collapse with the language of a slow decline, the way empires usually crumble across tedious decades. It describes it as a sudden, total, breathtaking crash. Fallen, fallen, it cries out, naming her twice as though once were not enough to capture the shock of the thing. The greatest economic power the world has ever known, the system that seemed as permanent as the ground underfoot, comes apart not over years but in the space of a single hour. 1 hour. That is the time frame the text insists on, and the choice is deliberate. This is not a recession. This is not a downturn that clever people ride out comfortably in their bunkers. This is the entire edifice of global wealth coming down like a demolished tower, so fast that the people inside barely have time to understand what is happening before it is already finished. The imagery of that hour is genuinely haunting once you slow down and actually picture it. The trade simply stops. The great flow of goods that circled the planet, the luxuries and the necessities alike, freezes in place. The lights go out, the music stops. All the endless commerce that defined the old order, all the buying and selling that had never once paused for as long as anyone could remember, falls silent in an afternoon. And the people who profited from it, the merchants and traders and financiers who grew unimaginably rich feeding the system and feeding off it, do the only thing left available to them. They stand at a safe distance and weep. The old text lingers on them, these ruined dealers watching the source of all their wealth burn, mourning not so much the woman herself as the fortunes that died alongside her. It is not, it must be said, the most sympathetic grief ever recorded. They are not crying for her. They are crying for their money. There is something uniquely eerie about the specific quiet that follows, and it is worth pausing on because it is not the quiet of peace. It is the quiet of an engine that has run without interruption for so long that no one alive remembers it ever being off, suddenly and completely stopping. The old order never rested. Its markets ran straight through every night. Its ships crossed every ocean without pause. Its lights burned in 1,000 cities that prided themselves on never once sleeping. For all of living memory, the machine simply hummed, so constant that people had long ago stopped hearing it, the way you stop hearing a refrigerator until the moment it clicks off, and the sudden silence startles you. This is that silence, scaled up to blanket the entire planet. A world that had forgotten it was even possible for the noise to stop is now standing in the abrupt, total stillness of its own switched-off heart, and the stillness turns out to be far more frightening than the crash that caused it. Try for a moment to grasp the sheer scale of what this means on a human level. The richest people who have ever lived, individuals whose wealth had grown so large it stopped feeling like a number and started feeling like a law of nature, lose all of it, not most of it, all of it. In a single night, the untouchable become the destitute, and the men who a day earlier could have bought entire countries discover they can no longer buy anything at all, because the whole apparatus that made their money mean something has simply ceased to exist. It is the kind of reversal that would be almost comic if it were not so complete. The ultimate demonstration that a fortune resting on confidence is only ever one bad morning away from being expensive confetti. But it would be a serious mistake to read all this as merely a very dramatic financial event, a market crash with the volume turned all the way up. What is actually happening here is far larger than money. This is the deliberate demolition of the entire existing world order, the old system, the one that ran things for as long as history bothers to remember, the one everyone simply assumed was how the world worked, is being torn down on purpose, by design, right on schedule, and demolition, importantly, always leaves something behind, which is empty space. Where the towering old order used to stand, there is now a vacuum, a gaping hole where the centre of global power used to sit, and vacuums, as any student of history will tell you, do not stay empty for long. Something always rushes in to fill them. There is a colder strategic reason he needed her gone too, one that runs deeper than any promise to any king. For all her foolishness about controlling the beast, the woman was, right up until this moment, the single greatest concentration of power on the planet that did not belong to him. She was the one force large enough to have rivaled him, the only counterweight heavy enough to balance the scales, the sole entity with enough wealth and reach to potentially say no to him and make it stick. As long as she existed, his control had a limit, an alternative, a competitor standing in the same room. By burning her down, he does not merely satisfy an old grudge or reward his allies. He removes the last thing on earth big enough to stand against him. After this hour, there is no rival left anywhere. There is only him and a great deal of freshly cleared space, and the kings, watching their old mistress burn, feel nothing but triumph. They got exactly what he promised them, the sweet satisfaction of finally throwing off the rider they had carried in silent resentment for so long. What not one of them pauses to consider, in the warm glow of that victory, is that they have just helped destroy the only power that might one day have protected them from the man they helped. They cheered the removal of his sole competition. They will have plenty of time later to reflect on the wisdom of that particular decision. That is the true genius and the true horror of what he has just done, and it reframes the whole event. He did not destroy the old world out of rage, or even primarily out of the grudge he had promised the kings. He destroyed it to make room. He's not merely a wrecker swinging a hammer for the pleasure of the noise. He's a builder who understands that you cannot raise something new on a lot that is already occupied. The old order had to come down not because he hated it, though he certainly did, but because it stood exactly where he intended to put something of his own. He has spent this entire stretch clearing the ground, and the new world he plans to raise on that cleared ground will have one defining feature the old one never had. It will answer, completely and without a single exception, to him. But a demolition on that scale does not happen without making enemies, and here is where the story takes its sharpest and most personal turn yet. The old elite, the ruined merchants and financiers and power brokers who watch their entire world burn in the space of an hour, do not simply accept their sudden poverty with quiet dignity. People who have lost everything rarely do. And these were not ordinary people. These were the most powerful individuals on the planet right up until the morning they were not, and men like that do not go gently into irrelevance. They go looking for someone to blame, and they do not have to look very hard at all, because the man responsible has been standing in the spotlight the entire time, graciously accepting the applause. So the shattered remnants of the old order do the only thing left to people with nothing to lose and a very specific grievance. They organize. Humiliated, stripped of the fortunes that were their entire identity, they pool whatever influence and resources they still have, and they aim all of it at a single target. If they cannot have their world back, they can at least take down the man who took it from them. It is revenge in its purest, most concentrated form, the desperate strike of the dispossessed against the one who dispossessed them. And for a brief moment it looks as though it might actually succeed. There is a question worth sitting with here, uncomfortable as it is, because the timing of all this is a little too convenient to ignore. A man this careful, this many steps ahead of everyone around him, this well informed by the forces we have already discussed, does not usually get caught flat-footed by his enemies. So either the one plot in the world capable of reaching him somehow slipped clean past a planner who has never once been surprised, or he saw it coming and quietly let it happen anyway, because a resurrection, by its very definition, requires a death to come first. It is genuinely hard to say which is true, and the text leaves the door open to both. But given everything we now know about how he operates, the possibility that he permitted his own assassination, that he walked knowingly into the blow because he understood precisely what surviving it would do to a watching world, is the kind of thought that makes the entire scene considerably colder. The greatest miracle of his career may have required, as its raw material, an attack he saw coming from a long way off. The world, still watching him as closely as it has watched anything in its history, sees it happen live. In front of what one imagines is the single largest audience ever assembled. The impossible occurs. The unstoppable man is stopped. The old text describes it with one startling image, noting that one of the beast heads appears to take a mortal wound, a blow to the head that should, by every rule of nature, be the abrupt end of the story. He falls. The great leader, the peacemaker, the answer to 1,000 years of prayer, is struck down in an instant, and the injury is not the kind anyone survives. For all his supernatural backing and all his meticulous planning, in that moment he looks like exactly what his enemies always insisted he was underneath the miracles. A man. And men, as everyone watching grimly understands, do not get up from this. The reaction is instant and global. His supporters, the countless millions who had come to adore him, who had pinned every hope they owned on his continued existence, are plunged all at once into shock and grief. The golden age they believed had just begun seems to end as abruptly as it started. The story of the most promising leader the world had ever produced, the one who ended the wars and healed the divisions and handed a waiting people their oldest dream, appears to stop mid-sentence, cut off by a single act of vengeance from the very people he had ruined. It is for a short and terrible interval a world in mourning, utterly convinced it has just watched its saviour die in front of it. And then, after a short time, he gets back up. He returns, alive, walking, speaking, whole, the fatal wound closed and healed over, leaving nothing behind but a scar to prove it had ever been there at all. The man who by every natural law should be a corpse is instead standing in front of the world, visibly recovered from an injury that no one recovers from, and you can imagine the effect of that far better than any description could deliver it. The grief of moments earlier curdles instantly into something else, something enormous, an awe so total it borders on hysteria. The people who are weeping are now simply staring, and the thing they are feeling is not relief. It is something much closer to terror braided together with rapture, the sensation of watching a fixed rule of the universe break, live in real time. This is the moment the false prophet has been waiting for his entire career, and he does not let a second of it go to waste. His whole role, as we established, is to take raw events and wrap them in the language of the sacred, to turn power into worship. He steps forward now holding the single greatest piece of material any propagandist has ever been handed, and he frames it in the only way that could possibly make sense of it. This, he proclaims, is no ordinary recovery. This is resurrection. The man has conquered death itself in full view of the entire world, and there is only one kind of being who conquers death. Not a politician, not even a prophet, a god. And here we arrive at the beat this whole strategy has been building toward from the very beginning, the one we flagged long ago when we first laid out the logic of the counterfeit. The genuine article, the one being imitated in reverse, was defined more than by anything else by a death and a rising, an execution followed by a return that changed everything and turned mere followers into worshippers. It was the single event the entire real story hinged upon. So of course the forgery aims straight at it. Of course the counterfeit stages its own version, its own death, its own miraculous return, complete with the wound to prove the death was real, and the healing to prove the resurrection was too. This is not a side effect of his rise. It is the centerpiece of it. Everything before was set up. This is the forged signature at the bottom of the whole document, the imitation of the one moment that mattered most, performed live for a planet already primed to believe it. It is worth being clear about something here, because people always want to know the trick. Whether that wound and that healing were entirely real, or an elaborate deception staged with the help of the powers standing behind him, is a question the watching world is in absolutely no position to answer, and here is the uncomfortable part. It does not actually matter. The effect is identical either way. A crowd cannot fact-check a miracle in the moment it happens. It can only witness the thing and it reacts to what it appears to see, not to whatever is metaphysically true beneath the surface. He understands this perfectly. He does not need the resurrection to be genuine. He only needs it to be convincing, and convincing is a far lower bar to clear, especially in front of an audience that had already decided long before the shot was ever fired that it very much wanted to believe. And it works. It works completely. Up to this point, for all his charisma and all his wonders, the world still saw him, at bottom, as a man. An extraordinary man, a beloved man, a man who seemed touched by something greater than himself, but a man all the same. That distinction dies with him on the ground, and simply fails to come back when he does, because a man who walks away from a mortal wound is no longer a man in the eyes of the people who watched it. The respect they felt for him, the admiration, the deep gratitude, all of it transforms in a single stroke into something far more dangerous and far harder to undo. It becomes worship. They stop seeing a remarkable human being and start seeing a god wearing a human face, which, as we have known all along, is precisely what he wanted them to see from the very start. Notice too what this single event does to everything that came before it. Every earlier sign, every wonder the false prophet performed, every impossible thing the crowd had witnessed and quietly half explained away, is suddenly recoloured by this. People who had privately wondered whether the fire from the sky was some clever piece of stagecraft, whether the piece was just uncommonly good luck, whether the whole meteoric rise was merely an unusually gifted man being unusually fortunate, now feel their doubts erased in a single stroke. Of course the miracles were real, they tell themselves. Of course he is what he claimed to be. Look, he beat death itself. A man who can do that could obviously have done all the rest without breaking a sweat. The resurrection does not merely win new believers. It reaches backward through the entire story and retroactively converts every old skeptic, turning every question mark that ever hung over him into an exclamation point. It is the capstone that suddenly makes the whole structure beneath it look solid. The old text captures the aftermath in one quiet, chilling observation. The whole world, it says, marvelled as it followed after the beast. That single sentence is the hinge the entire story turns on. marvelled, followed, not obeyed out of fear, not tolerated out of convenience, but followed in wonder, willingly, adoringly, the way you follow something you have chosen to believe in with your whole heart. And that is the difference that makes this moment irreversible. You can overthrow a ruler people merely fear. You can outlast a leader people merely tolerate. But a God that people have chosen to love, a God they watch defeat death with their own eyes, is an entirely different problem, because now their loyalty is no longer a political calculation that shifting circumstances can talk them out of. It is faith, and faith does not surrender to evidence, and worship as a tool of control has a property that fear could never so much as dream of. Fear has to be constantly maintained. It requires unrelenting pressure, an ever-present threat, someone always watching, because the instant that pressure lifts, fear evaporates, and people begin quietly testing the boundaries again. Worship maintains itself. A population that genuinely believes will police its own devotion, defend the object of its faith without ever being asked, and turn on the doubters within its own ranks with an enthusiasm no secret police force could ever hope to match. He will not need to force this new religion on anyone. The believers will spread it, guard it, and enforce it for him, free of charge, out of love, which is at once the most efficient and the most terrifying security system ever devised. He has not merely won the world's loyalty, he has quietly outsourced its enforcement to the world itself. This is the emotional summit of the entire first half of the story, the peak toward which everything has been climbing since he first stepped, unremarkable and overlooked out of that crowd. Before this moment he was the most successful politician who ever lived. After it, he is not a politician at all. He is the object of a global religion, a living deity in the minds of billions, worshipped by a world that believes, with the unshakable certainty of people who saw the miracle with their own eyes, that it is at last in the presence of the divine. The cult is sealed. The devotion is locked into place. And the most unsettling part of all is that the people bowing down are not being forced to do it. They are doing it gladly, gratefully, convinced beyond any possible argument that they have finally picked the right side. They have crowned him with their own hands. So the ground is cleared, the old world is ash, and its destroyer stands over the ruins transformed, in the eyes of everyone still standing, from a man into a god. Now, at last, he can begin building the thing he cleared all that space to make room for. A new order, entirely his own, rising up out of the wreckage of the old. But every kingdom needs its citizens to prove where their loyalty lies, and the price of admission to this particular one is going to be unlike anything the human race has ever been asked to pay. They crowned him gladly. They have simply not yet learned what it is going to cost them to live in the world he builds next. The world he builds next arrives, at first, looking far less like a nightmare and far more like a solution. That is the part worth bracing for, because the new order does not announce itself with chains and watchtowers. It announces itself with a promise, and the promise is a genuinely appealing one, which is exactly why so many people rush to accept it long before reading the terms. With the old system reduced to ash, someone has to rebuild the ordinary machinery of daily life, the buying and selling and working that the world cannot function without for very long, and he is the only one left standing to do it. So he steps forward, not as a conqueror imposing his will, but as a reformer graciously offering to fix everything that was broken about the world that just collapsed. Look what the old order did to you, he says in effect. It hoarded wealth for a tiny few while the rest of you scraped by. It was unfair, unequal, rigged against you from the start. But all of that is finished now. What comes next will belong to everyone equally. A single unified system with no more greed, no more inequality, no more of the chaos that so nearly destroyed you all. Order for everyone, fairness for everyone, unity for everyone. It is, on the surface, an almost irresistible pitch, and it is worth noticing how well it lands on a population that has just watched the richest people on earth turn into paupers overnight. To people traumatized by that collapse, a promise of stability and fairness does not sound like a threat. It sounds like a rescue. This is one of the oldest and most reliable moves in the entire playbook of control, and it works precisely because it comes dressed in the language of justice. Nobody signs up for tyranny when it is called tyranny. They sign up enthusiastically when it is called equality, when it arrives wearing the friendly face of a system that finally, at long last, works for the ordinary person. The cage is real. But it is being marketed as a shelter, and after the storm they just survived, a shelter is the one thing everybody wants. History, for what it is worth, has quietly rehearsed this exact bargain more than once, always on a smaller stage. Movements that promised perfect equality, that swore they would abolish the unfairness of the old world and share everything out fairly among everyone, have a long and rather unfunny habit of arriving instead at the most suffocating control their era could manage to build. It turns out that enforcing perfect sameness on millions of stubbornly different people requires an enormous amount of watching, and an enormous amount of watching is simply another word for a cage. The promise is always paradise. The delivery is always a very attentive set of eyes. He is running that same ancient bargain, only now with no rival system left anywhere on Earth to flee toward, which is the single detail that makes his version final, where every earlier attempt eventually cracked. There is a genuine and uncomfortable comparison hiding here between the world that fell and the world replacing it, and he is counting on people not to make it. The old order, the one that burned, was greedy, unequal, and often grotesque in its excess, and none of that was a lie. But for all its ugliness, it was loose. It left cracks a person could live in, corners it never bothered to watch, small freedoms that survived mostly because the system was far too busy making money to care what you did with your afternoons. What replaces it is cleaner, fairer sounding, and infinitely more thorough. It promises to fix every injustice of the old world, and in a certain sense it does, by the simple method of removing the freedom that made injustice possible in the first place. A prison, after all, is perfectly equal. Everyone inside gets the exact same cell. The old world let you starve in a crowd of billionaires. The new one guarantees you will never starve, provided only that you never, ever disagree. Which of those is genuinely worse is a harder question than it looks, and he is betting, correctly, that a frightened people will not pause to ask it. Then comes the centerpiece of the new order, and here the story crosses from clever politics into something genuinely uncanny. The false prophet, whose specialty we already know well, oversees the making of an image of the beast, a crafted likeness of the man now worshipped as a god. So far, nothing especially unusual. Rulers have been putting up statues of themselves since roughly the invention of ego. But this image does not stay a statue. According to the old text, the false prophet gives it breath, and the thing begins to do what no statue should ever do. It speaks. It comes to a kind of life, and it demands worship, and it carries the authority to condemn anyone who dares refuse to give it. Sit with the strangeness of that for a moment, because the parody buried inside it is almost too precise to be an accident. In the original story, these texts keep circling back toward the defining act of the true God at the very beginning was to take something lifeless and breathe life into it, to animate mere dust with genuine spirit. It is the signature move of a creator, the one act that most clearly belongs to God alone. And here is the counterfeit reaching straight for that power, animating a manufactured object, giving breath to a thing of human make, staging a grotesque imitation of the very act it has no right to touch. He is not content merely to be worshipped as a god. He wants to demonstrate the powers of one, to show a watching world that he too can breathe life into the lifeless. It is the creature not simply claiming the crown of the creator, but trying, clumsily and blasphemously, to copy his craft. And there is a practical horror to a speaking image that is easy to miss beneath all the supernatural spectacle of it. A statue is silent, and a silent thing can be ignored the instant the crowd wanders off. But an image that speaks, that watches, that can name and condemn the ones who withhold their worship, is something else entirely. It is a witness that never sleeps, an enforcer installed at the very center of the cult that never needs to eat or rest or be paid. Wherever its likeness stands, the eyes of the empire stand with it. People do not merely bow to it once and walk away. They live under it, always aware that the thing is watching, always conscious that a refusal will be noticed and remembered and reported. It is worship enforced not by soldiers at the door, but by the unshakable, inescapable sense that you are at every waking moment being seen. This speaking image is not decoration. It is the enforcement engine for what comes next, which is the part everyone has heard of even if they have never read a single word of the source. To live in the new economy, to buy anything or sell anything at all, every single person must receive a mark. It goes on the right hand or on the forehead, and without it the text is blunt. You are locked out completely. No mark, no transactions. No transactions, no food, no shelter, no medicine, no participation whatsoever in the ordinary business of staying alive. It is the most total economic control ever conceived, and it requires no soldier standing over anyone at all, because it does not need force. It only needs the checkout line. The placement of that mark is not random, and it rewards a closer look. The hand and the forehead were not chosen for convenience. They were chosen for meaning. The hand is what you act with, the symbol of your strength, your labor, your deeds. The forehead is what you think with, the symbol of your mind, your allegiance, your will. To be marked on both is to declare, in the plainest symbolic terms available, that you serve this empire with everything you do and everything you think, with all your strength and all your mind. And if that phrasing rings some distant bell, it should, because it is a deliberate dark echo of the ancient command to love the true God with all your heart and mind and strength. The mark is not merely a barcode for the till. It is a counterfeit of devotion, a forced parody of the wholehearted love that was only ever meant to be given freely and to someone else entirely. It is worth adding that the mark is designed to be far more than a permission slip for the marketplace. It is meant to be an identity. To carry it is not simply to be allowed to shop. It is to belong, to be visibly and permanently one of his, a member of the unified whole, rather than an outsider standing suspiciously apart from it. In a world just terrified half to death by collapse and chaos, belonging is not a small thing. It is a deep human hunger, and he offers to satisfy it completely, so long as you accept his particular brand of it stamped where everyone can see. The mark says you are safe, you are inside, you are one of us. The only catch, and it is a considerable one, is that there is now precisely one us, and it wears his face, and stepping outside of it is no longer a thing that is permitted. Bound up with all of this is the number, the one small string of digits that has escaped the pages of the old text and lodged itself in the imagination of very nearly everyone, whether they believe a word of any of this or not. The number of the beast, 666. The text presents it as the number of a man, a figure somehow inseparable from his identity and his system, and people have spent roughly 2,000 years trying to crack it like a safe, matching it to names and titles and, in the more excitable eras, to whichever ruler they happen to dislike that particular week. Most of those attempts reveal considerably more about the person doing the guessing than about the number itself, but the likeliest meaning is quieter and frankly more interesting than any code. In the symbolic arithmetic these texts run on, 7 is the number of completion, of perfection, of the divine. 6 is what falls just short of it, over and over, the number that reaches for perfection and misses every single time. Repeat it 3 times and you no longer have a cipher, you have a portrait, a being straining with everything he has to be God, and falling short, and falling short, and falling short again. The number is not a lock to be picked, it is a diagnosis. So consider at last what has actually been built here, because the full shape of it is worse than any single piece taken on its own. Control of the economy has quietly become control of life itself. When one system alone decides who is allowed to buy bread and who is not, it has stopped being merely an economy. It is a hand around every throat, gentle for the moment, but a hand all the same. Refusing the mark is nothing like refusing a membership card. It does not simply exclude you from a convenience, it removes you from the very possibility of survival, and then, because the system cannot tolerate the existence of anyone who said no, it goes further still. Refusal is not treated as a private choice to be respected. It is treated as a crime. To decline the mark is to be branded an enemy of the unity everyone else agreed to, a threat to the order, a problem to be dealt with rather than a citizen to be left in peace. And dealing with problems in a system like this one does not tend to mean a strongly worded letter. This is the eerie, airless logic at the very heart of the whole arrangement, and it deserves to be stated plainly. Freedom has been traded willingly for the promise of unity, and once that trade is made, disagreement itself becomes intolerable. A system built on total unity cannot allow even a little dissent, because every dissenter is living proof that the unity was never really total, never really chosen, never really the paradise it was sold as. So the ones who refuse are not debated with. They are hunted, and the deepest tragedy is that most people never face that terrible choice at all, because most people, entirely understandably, do not want to starve. They take the mark. Not because they have thought long and hard about what it means, but because the line for food is right there, and their children are hungry, and the person behind the counter is waiting, and unity, whatever it may quietly cost, is starting to look a great deal more comfortable than the alternative, That is how the most complete control in human history gets installed. Not at gunpoint. At the checkout, one reasonable, frightened, perfectly understandable decision at a time. And yet, quietly, against the whole weight of all that pressure, a few do refuse. It barely registers at first. Only a scattering of people here and there who look at the mark, and the image, and the entire comfortable machinery of it, and simply will not. They cannot always explain the refusal in a way that satisfies the officials. They only know that some line inside them will not be crossed, that whatever it costs, they will not bow to the thing in the temple or wear its name on their skin. For now they are a rounding error, a minor inconvenience the system fully expects to crush without much effort at all. But their existence matters far more than their numbers suggest, because it proves that the unity was never quite as total as advertised. Somewhere out there, a stubborn handful is still saying no, and that small, unglamorous defiance is the first faint crack in a world that had believed itself perfectly sealed. We will come back to them, because their story is a very long way from over. But even now, with the economy clenched in his fist and the whole living world lining up to be marked, there is one thing he still does not have, and its absence gnaws at him precisely because everything else has come so easily. Look back across the full sweep of his climb, and you will notice it has been, from the very beginning, a campaign of conquest against gods, not merely against kings and systems, but against every rival source of meaning and devotion the world had to offer. He toppled the old economic order that people quietly worshipped with their wallets. He absorbed the squabbling religions and turned their reverence toward himself. One by one he has defeated or swallowed every object of human loyalty on the planet, and a man who has conquered all the gods has inevitably only one opponent left worth the challenge, the real one. He already possesses almost everything a god could want. He has the worship of billions. He has the living image speaking in his name. He has a high priest in the false prophet tending the flame of his cult with tireless devotion. What he does not yet have is the single thing that would make the conquest complete, the final trophy, the last patch of ground still technically holding out against him. He wants the sacrifice. He wants the worship that has, for the entire Golden Age, been flowing not to him, but to the God of Israel, in the rebuilt temple that he himself made possible. It is the one altar left in the world not yet bearing his name, and to a man who has claimed every other, that single stubborn exception is unbearable. It is worth asking why he waited so long to move on it, why he endured 3.5 years of pretending to honour a god he intended all along to replace. A lesser tyrant would have seized the temple on the very first day, drunk on his own momentum, but he understood something the lesser sort never do, which is that you cannot successfully demand worship from people who still have somewhere else to place it. Had he made this claim earlier, while the wars were fresh and the peace unproven and the old faith still fully intact, the world would have recoiled in horror. Instead, he spent the first half of the 7 years quietly making himself indispensable, weaving his presence into every comfort the people now depend on, until refusing him would mean refusing the entire life they have built around him. Only then, with the trap fully set and every alternative gently removed, does he spring it. The patience was never restraint. It was preparation. He waited until saying no to him had become almost the same act as saying no to survival itself. And here, at last, the clock we set running long ago finishes its first half and strikes its terrible middle. Remember the 7 years, and remember the warning that the number had a midpoint. This is it. Exactly halfway through the covenant that brought the world its false peace, precisely on schedule, the mask he has worn so patiently finally comes off. The old prophecy in Daniel pinpoints the instant with chilling accuracy. In the middle of the 7, it says, he puts a stop to the sacrifice. The very thing he granted with such apparent generosity 3.5 years earlier, the resumption of the ancient worship that made him look like the answer to 1,000 years of prayer, he now abruptly cancels. The gift is revoked, and the people who spent those years mistaking his gift for genuine kindness are about to learn what it was really for all along. Because he does not merely halt the old worship and leave the altar quietly empty. That would be nothing more than policy. What he does is infinitely more audacious. He walks into the temple itself, the holiest ground those people know, the place set apart across all of history for one purpose and one presence, and he sits down in it as though it were his own throne. And then he does the very thing every step of his long ascent has been secretly building toward. He declares himself God. Not a representative of God, not a prophet or a messenger or a specially favoured ruler, but God himself in the flesh, seated in the very house built for the worship of another. Where the sacrifices to the true God had risen faithfully for 3.5 years, he now installs that speaking image of himself and commands that the reverence of the world be pointed there instead. There is an ancient name for this exact act, and it is worth knowing where it comes from, because the horror of it was recognized long before it ever happened. The old prophet Daniel foresaw it and gave it a phrase that has echoed down the centuries since: the abomination of desolation. A defilement so complete that it empties the holy place of everything that made it holy, a desecration that leaves behind only ruin where the sacred used to stand. Centuries later, the one these texts hold up as the true Messiah pointed directly back to Daniel's words and warned his own listeners to watch for this precise moment, the setting up of the abomination where it ought never to be, as the signal that the darkest hour had finally arrived. Two separate voices, generations apart, staring across a great gulf of time at the same event and calling it by the same name. When two prophets that far removed agree that closely on the details, it tends to be worth paying attention. That word, desolation, is doing careful work, and it repays a moment's thought. It does not simply mean damage, the way a battle desolates a field. It means emptiness, a hollowing out, the removal of the very thing that gave a place its purpose, until nothing meaningful is left inside the shell. A temple stripped of the presence it was built to house is not merely vandalized. It is desolate, an empty room wearing the costume of a holy one, grand and ornamented and utterly hollow. That is the true nature of what he installs there. He does not bring some rival glory into the sacred space. He brings a void dressed up as a god and calls the emptiness worship. Everything he touches at this scale works the very same way, offering the shape of a thing while quietly removing its substance. And here he does it to the holiest room those people had. Now feel the full weight of the substitution, because this is where the genuine tragedy of the whole story lives, and it is far crueler than simple villainy. Put yourself in the place of the people watching this happen, the very ones who welcomed him most warmly of all. They had waited longer than any people on earth for their promised deliverer, and along came a man who did everything they expected that deliverer to do. He brought them peace after endless war. He handed them victory over enemies who had oppressed them for as long as memory reached back. He gave them their temple and their oldest dream restored. Everything a savior was supposed to do, he did, flawlessly, right on cue. So when this man, this proven miracle worker, this apparent answer to every prayer, finally sits in the holy place and announces that the worship belongs to him now, a horrifying number of them are already primed to agree. He has spent years earning precisely the trust that this single moment betrays. The gifts were never kindness, they were grooming. Every good thing he handed them was a down payment on exactly this, the moment he would ask for their souls and discover they had already, without ever realizing it, half-handed them over. Not everyone is fooled, though, and it is important to say so, because their clarity is about to cost them everything they have. Scattered through the celebrating crowds are those who see this act for exactly what it is, and for them there is nothing confusing about it at all. It is the unmasking they had quietly dreaded through every year of the Golden Age, the confirmation of a suspicion they could never quite prove while the peace held and the prosperity flowed. To them, the man in the temple is not a savior revealing some deeper glory. He is a fraud finally showing his true face, and the sight of him seated where he has no right to sit fills them not with awe, but with a horror so deep it steadies them. Strangely, this is the moment their resolve hardens rather than breaks. A lie is always hardest to resist while it is still pretending to be the truth. Once it stands up in the holy place and openly demands to be called God, the pretending is over, and a certain kind of person finds it far, far easier to refuse a monster than to doubt a friend. And so the unthinkable substitution completes itself. In the place where the true God was worshipped, a man now receives worship. The creation sets itself up in the seat of the Creator and dares the universe to raise an objection. This is the moment his pride reaches its absolute summit, the highest and darkest peak of an ambition that began, according to these texts, before humanity so much as existed. Everything else, the rise, the treaty, the fall of the old world, the staged resurrection, all of it was only ever scaffolding, built to reach this single point, the point at which the creature finally, openly, and without a shred of shame, declares itself God. It is worth recognizing too that this is not some brand new sin so much as the oldest one there is, blown up to its maximum possible scale. The very first temptation in the whole tradition these texts belong to was not a temptation to steal or to kill. It was a whisper, suggesting that a creature might become like God, might step out of its proper place and seize the throne standing above it. Every act of pride in all the ages since has been a small, faint echo of that first reach. And here, in the temple, that ancient whisper reaches full volume at last, embodied in a single man who has taken the oldest lie in existence and lived it all the way out to its ultimate conclusion. He is not doing something unprecedented. He is doing the first thing that was ever done wrong, finally, completely, and out loud. Understand as well the sheer totality of the claim he is making, because it is not the modest ambition of a man who merely wants to be obeyed. Plenty of rulers have wanted obedience. He wants something no ruler ever seriously reached for. He wants to sit above every god that any human being has ever bowed to be not one deity among the many the world has worshipped, but the single one to whom all the others must yield, a god over gods, the final authority, the last word, the top of every hierarchy that has ever existed in heaven or on earth. It is a claim so vast that it leaves no room for anything above it, which is precisely the problem, because there is in fact something above it, and that something has spent this entire story quietly declining to be impressed. Set the two halves of his design side by side finally, and the shape of the whole grasp becomes unmistakable. The mark, back in the marketplace, claimed the outer life, the body, the hands, the daily business of survival, binding a person's ability to eat and live to their loyalty to him. Now, in the temple, he reaches for the inner life, the soul, the worship, the deepest allegiance a human being has to give. One demand for the body, one for the spirit, and between the two of them, not a sliver of a person left unclaimed. This was never really about power in the ordinary sense, about taxes and armies and borders on a map. It was about ownership, total and complete, of every human being alive, inside and out. The mark and the throne in the temple are not two separate ambitions that happen to line up. They are the two hands of a single grasp, closing at last around the entire species at once. This is the spiritual centre of the whole story, the pivot on which everything before it and everything after it turns. Up to this instant, the momentum has run entirely his way. Every move he made worked. Every gamble he took paid off. Every obstacle in his path fell before him with almost embarrassing ease, until it began to seem, to him and to the watching world alike, that nothing anywhere could possibly stand against him. And there lies the miscalculation buried deep inside his moment of greatest triumph, the flaw he is far too proud to notice. In his own mind, sitting down in that seat is the finish line, the last conquest, the final proof that he has won completely and forever. What it actually is, though he does not yet grasp it, is very nearly the opposite. Every previous opponent he faced was something that could be outthought, outspent, outmaneuvered, or burned to the ground, and so he came, understandably enough, to believe that everything could be. But he has now aimed the full force of his ambition at the one target that plays by entirely different rules, a target that was never truly resisting him at all, but simply allowing him exactly enough room to reveal, fully and beyond any possible doubt, precisely what he was. He mistook that room for weakness, he mistook patience for absence, and in the single act he considers his masterpiece, the crowning proof of his own divinity, he has in truth done nothing more than finish drawing the target on his own back. The creature on the throne is certain he has just won the war. He has in fact only just guaranteed that he will lose it. The mask is off. The claim is made. The creature is seated on the Creator's throne, calling it home and daring the heavens to answer. And from that precise moment, the long, patient and utterly certain reckoning that this whole story has been quietly moving toward finally and irreversibly begins. The reckoning does not announce itself with thunder, at least not yet. It begins, fittingly for a story this patient, with two men. Two ordinary-looking figures who show up in the very heart of his triumph and do the one thing the entire marked and worshipping world has stopped doing. They tell the truth about him, out loud, and they flatly refuse to stop. For all his conquest of gods and economies, for all the billions bowing to his image, there turn out to be voices he simply cannot silence, and the old text hands us the first and loudest of them right here. Revelation introduces two witnesses, two prophets who appear during this darkest stretch and spend 1,260 days speaking against everything he has built, against his covenant, against his mark, against his system, against the enormous gleaming lie that he is God. For roughly 3.5 years, the exact length of his unmasked reign, these two stand in open opposition, a living rebuttal broadcast to a planet that had convinced itself all opposition was finished for good. People have wondered for a very long time who exactly these two are, and the text keeps their names to itself, which has never once stopped anyone from guessing. The clues, though, point somewhere interesting. A pair of prophets who can call down drought and turn rivers to blood and summon plagues at will are wearing the unmistakable fingerprints of two of the greatest figures in the old tradition, one who once shut the heavens so that it did not rain for years, and one who once brought a river of blood and a cascade of plagues down on an empire that had enslaved his people. Whether the two witnesses are those very men returned, or new prophets working in the same ancient power, the text leaves open. But the resemblance is clearly deliberate. These are not random troublemakers with a grudge. They are living reminders, walking quotations of the exact moments in history when heaven last humbled a man who dared to call himself untouchable. Now you might reasonably expect two lone protesters to last about an afternoon against a man who commands the worship of the world and controls whether anyone eats, and ordinarily you would be entirely right. But these two come with a rather significant advantage, which is that they cannot be killed. The text is almost gleeful about the details. Anyone who moves against them, anyone who so much as approaches with harm in mind, is met with fire that pours out from their mouths and consumes the attacker on the spot. This is not, to put it mildly, a debate the Empire is equipped to win with its usual methods. You cannot arrest them, you cannot buy them, you cannot starve them out, and every assassin sent to handle the problem quietly becomes a cautionary tale for the next one in line. Their other abilities read like a deliberate greatest hits collection, and the choice of them is not remotely an accident. They can shut up the sky so that no rain falls for the length of their prophecy, turning off the weather like a household tap. They can turn water into blood. They can strike the earth with plagues as often as they please. And if all of that sounds strangely familiar, it is meant to. These are the signature moves from a very old story, the plagues that once fell on Egypt when another self-declared god sat on a throne and insisted he answered to no one higher than himself. That ancient ruler learned, the hard way, and one disaster at a time, that setting yourself up as a god tends to attract the personal attention of the actual one. The two witnesses are quoting that old lesson straight back at the new pretender, plague for plague, as if to remind him that the universe has run this exact scenario before, and it did not end well for the man in the palace. There is something almost darkly comic about the position this puts the Empire in, if you can find the humour in a global superpower being outmanoeuvred by two men and a great deal of patience. Here is a regime that toppled the wealthiest system in history, that marked the entire planet, that made itself worshipped as divine, and it cannot solve the problem of two elderly prophets standing in a public square saying rude and accurate things about the leadership. Every tool in the vast imperial toolbox turns out to be useless. Force gets incinerated. Bribery is beneath them. Persuasion bounces clean off. The most powerful man who has ever lived is reduced for 3.5 years to gritting his teeth and waiting, because the one thing his empire genuinely cannot do is order the truth to shut up. It is a strangely reassuring spectacle, a reminder that raw power, however total it looks from a distance, has a surprisingly short reach when it comes to the things that actually matter. The word the text uses for these two, witness, carries more freight than it first appears. In the language it comes from, a witness is not merely someone who saw a thing and can describe it later. The word is bound up so tightly with the idea of testimony, given at great personal cost, that it eventually became the root of our word for someone who dies for what they will not deny. A witness, in this deepest sense, is a person whose entire life, and if it comes to it their death, is the evidence. That is precisely what these two are. They do not simply say the beast is a fraud. They embody the counterclaim with their whole existence, standing as living proof that there is a power he does not command, and then, when the moment comes, becoming the proof all over again by refusing to stay dead. While those two are making the Empire miserable in public, something quieter is happening in parallel, and it introduces a piece the whole story has been building toward without quite saying so. God marks his own. We spent a long time on the mark of the beast, the brand of ownership stamped on hand and forehead that binds a person to the new order. Now we meet its opposite number. The Old Text describes a sealed group, 144,000 of them, drawn from the tribes of Israel, marked by God with a seal on their foreheads. And here the parallel becomes impossible to ignore, because it is so obviously meant to be noticed. Both sides mark their people on the forehead. Both claim their own with a visible sign of ownership. But the two marks could not possibly mean more opposite things. One is a brand of submission that buys you bread and costs you everything. The other is a seal of protection that costs you nothing and keeps you untouchable. The beast marks his to control them. God marks his to shield them. Same spot, opposite universe. The Old Text tells us a little more about this sealed number, and the details paint a picture of the exact opposite of everyone who took the other mark. Where the marked bowed in order to survive, these are described as ones who did not bend, who kept themselves unstained by the whole rotten arrangement, who follow the genuine article wherever he goes rather than chasing the counterfeit. They are called a kind of first fruits, a first harvest, which is a quietly hopeful word, because a first harvest implies there is a much larger one still on the way. They are not the last of the faithful making a doomed final stand. They are the leading edge of something far bigger, the first names read off a list that is nowhere near finished. And every one of them is proof, walking around in plain sight, that it was always possible to refuse, that the mark was never truly inescapable, that even at the very height of his power there were people the beast simply could not have. That sealed remnant is for the moment entirely beyond his reach, protected by a power that outranks his own, and their very existence is a quiet insult to a man who believed he had claimed every human being alive. He marked the whole world, or thought he did, but scattered through it is a number he never touched, sealed by a hand he cannot see, and no amount of economic pressure or military force can pry that seal loose. For all his talk of total control, there is a group walking around wearing someone else's name, and there is precisely nothing he can do about it. Which brings us back to the two witnesses, and to the strange rule that governs their fate. They are invincible, but not permanently, and the text is careful and specific about this in a way that matters enormously. They cannot be harmed until they have finished their testimony, not until they are defeated, not until the empire finally outmuscles them, but until their appointed work is simply done. Their protection was never about strength at all. It is about timing. For exactly as long as they still have something left to say, nothing on earth can lay a finger on them. And the moment their message is complete, right on the schedule set by someone very far above the beast, that protection lifts, and only then does the enemy finally get his turn. So at last the beast, described here as the one who climbs up out of the abyss we met so long ago, is permitted to do what he has been failing to do for years. He kills them, and you can imagine the relief and then the ugliness of what follows. Their bodies are left lying in the open street of the great city, deliberately unburied, put on display like trophies, for 3.5 days. It is a petty, vindictive little touch, the gesture of a man who spent 3.5 years being publicly humiliated by two people he could not touch, and is now determined to gloat over the corpses for as long as he can get away with it. And the world, it must be said, gloats right along with him, in one of the more unsettling scenes in the whole account. The nations do not merely feel relieved that the two troublemakers are finally gone, they celebrate. They throw what amounts to a global holiday over the dead bodies, and the text adds a detail that is almost too on the nose to believe. They send each other gifts, an entire planet exchanging presents in festive delight, because the two people who kept telling them uncomfortable truths have at last been shut up. It is the darkest possible parody of a holiday, a season of goodwill declared over a pair of corpses in the road, and it tells you everything about how thoroughly the world has come to hate the sound of the truth. The party lasts 3.5 days, which unfortunately for everyone still holding a gift, turns out to be exactly 3.5 days too short. Because while the bodies lie there and the celebration rages on, something enters them. The breath of life, the text says, from God himself. And in front of the entire watching world, the very same world still mid-celebration, the two men stand back up. Not staged, not healed by hidden technology, not framed and spun by a waiting propagandist. They simply die, stay visibly dead for days, and then rise, on their own schedule, at a word from heaven. A voice calls to them from above, telling them to come up, and they ascend into the sky in a cloud while their enemies stand frozen, watching the impossible unfold with their party hats still on. This is the beat the whole story has quietly been setting up, and the contrast is the entire point of it. We already watched a resurrection in this story, back when the beast took a mortal wound and rose again to seal his cult. That one worked. It convinced the world and turned respect into worship. But it was, as we discussed, a performance, real or faked, but designed either way to be believed. This one is different in a way that lands like a slap. There is no showman narrating it, no false prophet on hand to frame it as proof of divinity, no marketing whatsoever. It just happens, cleanly and publicly, and entirely outside his control, and it does something to the crowd that nothing has managed to do since he first rose to power. It plants a doubt. Because a genuine resurrection, one the Empire did not stage and cannot explain, raises a question the marked and worshipping world has not permitted itself to ask in years. If his enemies can do that, if the god they mocked can reach down and raise the dead in the middle of the beast's own capital, then maybe the man in the temple is not the final authority after all. Maybe the staring contest with heaven is not going quite the way they were told it was. It is only a doubt, only a hairline crack, only a handful of people quietly beginning to wonder. But every collapse in history started with a single crack, and this is the first one to appear in a world that believed itself perfectly sealed. It is worth dwelling on how much weight rests on that first small doubt, because from here it only grows. A cult of the kind he built has one fatal vulnerability, which is that it runs entirely on certainty. As long as every believer is sure, the whole structure holds, each person's confidence quietly propping up everyone else's. But certainty is a strange and brittle thing. It does not erode gradually the way stone wears down. It holds perfectly, right up until it does not, and then it goes all at once. A single public event the leader cannot explain, witnessed by enough people, is exactly the sort of thing that turns unshakable faith into a spreading, whispered question. He spent years making his followers absolutely certain of him. The two witnesses, in the manner of their rising, handed those same followers their first real reason to wonder, and a worshipper who has begun to wonder is no longer entirely his. And to underline the point past all possible missing, a great earthquake strikes the city in that very hour, bringing down 1/10 of it and killing 7,000, as though the ground itself wanted a word. The witnesses were right all along. His power was never absolute. God, it turns out, always keeps a few of his own voices in the room, no matter how loudly the Empire insists it has silenced every last one. The man in the temple is not a fool, and he feels the shift in the air the instant it happens. He has spent his entire career reading crowds better than anyone alive, sensing the exact moment a mood begins to turn, and he can feel the doubt spreading now like a cold draught through a house he was certain he had sealed. A ruler who depends on worship cannot afford even a little of it going missing, and he knows perfectly well that a cult which starts asking questions is a cult already beginning to die. So he does what men like him always do when the story slips even slightly out of their grip. He stops persuading and starts punishing, and he knows exactly where to aim first. He turns, with cold and sudden fury, on the very people who welcomed him most warmly of all. Remember, this is the halfway point of the whole 7-year arrangement, the hinge everything swings on, and the covenant that started it was above all a promise to Israel, the deal that handed them peace, and their temple and their oldest dream restored. He now tears that promise to shreds. The people who greeted him as their long-awaited deliverer, who celebrated him in the streets, who trusted him with their most sacred ground, discover in the space of a single breath that they were never his beloved at all, they were his setup. Having used their welcome to climb into the holy place, he now turns to destroy the very ones who lifted him there, which is a particularly bitter flavour of betrayal, the kind that only works at all because the trust behind it was so complete. There is a cold, strategic logic to striking them first, on top of the sheer spite of it. The people who once believed in him most completely are, now that the spell is breaking, the most dangerous witnesses he has. They know, better than anyone alive, the exact shape of the promise he made and then broke. Their disillusionment carries a weight that no lifelong skeptics ever could, because they can testify to the before and the after, to the man who handed them peace, and the man who now hunts them through it. A convert's doubt is contagious in a way an outsider's simply never is. So he moves against them not only because his old rage has finally been given permission to show itself, but because they have become, overnight, the single most credible threat to the story he has spent 7 years so carefully telling. The most devoted followers make the most damning defectors, and he knows it in his bones. He does not do it alone, and this is where his method shows itself one final time, the same two-step he has used since he first moved against the old order. First the economic noose, then the sword. Those who refused his mark were already locked out of the marketplace, unable to buy or sell, surviving on the ragged margins of a world that had quietly agreed they no longer belonged in it. That was the first squeeze, the patient one, the slow strangulation of anyone who would not bow. Now he tightens the second hand. He turns the surrounding nations, and before long, essentially the whole world against them, and what had been mere economic exclusion becomes an open, declared hunt. The refusers and the faithful, everyone who would not wear his name or worship his image, are marked now not for the checkout line but for destruction. This is the stretch the old texts give a specific and heavy name. The one held up as the true Messiah called it the Great Tribulation, and he was emphatic about its scale, describing it as a time of trouble unlike anything the world had seen from its very beginning or would ever see again. Not the worst so far, the worst, full stop, a peak of suffering so severe that it stands entirely alone in all of history. It is not a phrase to be tossed around lightly, and the text does not toss it. This is the darkest valley of the entire story, the stretch where it genuinely appears that the faithful have no future left at all, that the beast will simply grind every last opponent into the ground and finish what his mark began. It is worth understanding why this particular persecution earns a superlative that no earlier one ever did, because the world has certainly seen dark chapters before. What makes this one stand alone is its reach. Every previous time the faithful were hunted, there was somewhere a border to run for, a friendlier country, a corner of the map the persecutors did not control. There was always an elsewhere. This time there is not. The beast rules the whole board. The economy that locks people out is global. The worship demanded is universal. There is no neighbouring kingdom to flee to, no rival power to shelter beneath, no patch of ground left anywhere beyond his reach, which is exactly why the shelter that appears next has to be miraculous rather than merely geographical. When there is no safe country left anywhere on earth, the only safe place is one that God himself prepares, off the map entirely. Because the story does not leave us in that darkness without a light, and here it hands us one of its most tender images tucked right into the middle of the horror. Cast your mind back to the woman clothed with the sun from the very beginning, the one the dragon was so desperate to devour. The old text returns to her now, and it shows her fleeing. She runs into the wilderness, into a place prepared for her in advance by God, where she is sheltered and fed and kept safe for 1,260 days, the very same span the witnesses prophesied, the very same 3.5 years of the beast's unmasked rage. She's even given, the text says, the wings of a great eagle to carry her there, out of the serpent's reach. She stands for the protected remnant, the faithful ones God does not abandon to the slaughter, but hides and preserves through the very worst of it. The dragon rages and pursues, but he cannot reach her in the place prepared for her. Even here, at the absolute bottom of the darkness, there is a hidden shelter, a people kept, a quiet promise that the fury has a fence around it that it is not allowed to cross. That fence is the single most important thing to understand about this whole terrible stretch, because it changes what the darkness actually means. The beast is powerful, yes, and his cruelty in these months is real and enormous. But the old text is strangely, pointedly specific about one number, and it is worth holding on to tightly. His authority to act like this is given to him for 42 months, not forever. 42 months, which is once again that same 3.5 years arriving in yet another costume. The detail hiding inside that one word given is the whole hope of the chapter. His power in this season is not something he seized and gets to keep for as long as he likes. It is something granted, on loan, with an expiration date already stamped onto it by a hand far above his own. He's a dog on a chain who is utterly convinced he's running free, and the chain has a length he has not quite reached yet but very soon will. And there is a deeper defeat hidden inside his apparent triumph, one he is far too focused on winning to notice. His entire system, from the very first mark stamped onto the very first hand, was built on a single foundational demand: total worship. Not most of the world bowing, but all of it, Every mind and every pair of hands, unanimous and without exception. That was the whole point of the mark and the image and the throne in the temple, to leave no holdouts anywhere. Which means every single person who refuses to bow, even one starving straggler hiding in the hills, even one who dies with the word no still on their lips, is a hole punched in a system that only works if it is airtight. He can kill them. What he cannot do is make them worship, and killing a person who would not bend does not fill the gap they leave behind. It makes it permanent. Every refusal he fails to break is a small, quiet defeat dressed up as a victory, and the faithful, simply by not bending, are defeating the one thing his empire genuinely needs, whether they live through the night or not. He does not know that, of course, or he refuses to believe it, which in the end comes to the same thing. From where he stands, drunk on the temple and the worship and the mark, it looks as though nothing anywhere can stop him, and the 42 months feel less like a limit than like all the time in the world. So he presses his advantage with everything he has. The hunt intensifies. The pressure on the sealed and the sheltered and the stubborn grows heavier by the day. And to anyone actually living through it, without the benefit of knowing the number written on the chain, it genuinely seems as though hope itself has finally run out. The faithful are cornered. The witnesses are gone, at least for now. The woman is hidden, but hunted. The entire weight of a worshipping world is bearing down on a scattered, starving, hated few who have nothing left to defend themselves with except a flat refusal to bow. And it is worth saying plainly what actually holds these cornered people together, because from the outside it can look like nothing more than stubbornness, a refusal to take the easy path for reasons no reasonable person would accept. But it is not stubbornness. It is memory, and it is expectation. They remember that the same text describing this darkness also described its ending, that the 42 months were always written down as a limit and never once as a life sentence. They are not enduring because they believe the beast is weak. They can see perfectly well that he is not. They endure because they believe, against every visible fact pressing in around them, that his clock is running out, and that someone is coming, and that holding on for even one more day is worth it if the dawn is real. It is the hardest kind of hope there is, the kind you keep burning in total darkness with no evidence but a promise, and it is the one thing the beast, for all his power, has never once managed to take from them. It is, by design, the darkest moment in the entire story, the point where every thread of tension is pulled to its absolute limit, and it appears, for all the world, that the creature on the throne has finally, permanently won. That is precisely how these things tend to work, and the old texts understand it better than any storyteller. The night is never blacker than in the last hour before the sky begins to lighten. The old rhythm, once you have read enough of it, almost never sends rescue while things are merely bad. It waits. It holds off until bad has curdled into hopeless, until every human option is exhausted, and every door has swung shut, and the situation has passed well beyond anything effort or cleverness could still fix. And there is a reason for that pattern, and it is not cruelty. It is so that when the help finally arrives, no one alive can mistake it for a lucky break, or a clever plan, or a tide that simply turned on its own. By the time the darkness is this total, any light that breaks it will be unmistakable, undeniable, and impossible to credit to anyone but the one who sent it. So the beast has, without meaning to and without noticing, arranged the perfect conditions for exactly the kind of arrival he would least want. He has cleared away every rival, marked the earth, silenced the temple, and cornered the last of the faithful, and now he stands over what he is utterly certain is his final victory, savouring it, blind to the one detail he was never quite able to erase, the chain, the 42 months, the fence around his fury that he has been steadily, unknowingly running out of room inside this entire time. And in the very deepest part of that darkness, on the exact day when the beast's camp is most convinced the game is finally, permanently over, something is about to happen that not a single one of them has planned for, prepared for, or so much as imagined was possible. The thing the beast never planned for begins, as these things so often do, with him feeling more certain of victory than he has ever felt in his life. Convinced the end of all resistance is finally within reach, he makes his last and largest move. He decides to gather everything, every army, every force still loyal to him across the entire earth, and bring all of it to bear on the last holdouts in one final, crushing blow. No more patience, no more slow strangulation. He wants the whole thing finished, in one place, at one time, with overwhelming force, and he sets about summoning the militaries of the world to a single battlefield. What he does not appreciate, because his pride has never once let him see it, is that he is not actually the one doing the gathering. He thinks the plan is his. It is not. He is being drawn, along with every king who follows him, toward a precise spot on the map, herded there by exactly the sort of forces he believes he commands. Remember the target he unknowingly painted on his own back the moment he sat down in the temple and called himself God. This is the universe quietly collecting on it. He believes he is marching to a massacre. He is in fact being walked to the one appointment he was always going to keep. There is a bitter symmetry in this that the whole story has been patiently arranging. The one ability that defined him from the very start, back when he was the small, overlooked player who rose by gathering others to himself, was his genius for pulling people into one place under a single will. He gathered the kings, he gathered the worship of the world. He gathered the entire economy into his fist. Gathering was always his signature move, the thing he did better than anyone alive, and now that very gift becomes the instrument of his ruin, because the final thing he gathers, with all his considerable skill, is every enemy of heaven into one field, on one day, in one conveniently located spot, effectively setting the table for his own defeat. He spends his last free act assembling, at enormous effort, precisely the target that is about to be struck. His greatest strength, followed all the way to the bottom, turns out to have been a shovel he was digging with the entire time. The mechanism of that gathering is one of the stranger images in the whole account, and it is worth a look for its sheer oddity. Out of the mouths of the three members of that counterfeit trinity, the dragon and the beast and the false prophet, come three unclean spirits, and the text describes them, with what has to be intentional comedy, as looking like frogs. After everything, after the peace and the resurrection and the throne in the temple and the God over gods pretensions, the last great supernatural campaign of the enemy comes hopping out looking like something you would find in a pond. These frog spirits fan out across the world, working signs and wonders one final time, whispering into the ear of every ruler still standing, convincing them all to bring their forces to one appointed place. It is the last deception, the closing act of the propaganda machine that has run this entire story, and it works exactly as designed. The kings come. All of them. There is a reason the imagery reaches specifically for frogs, and it is not only that they are faintly ridiculous. It is another callback to that same old story we keep returning to, the one where a self-declared god on a throne squared off against the real one and lost by slow degrees. Frogs were one of the plagues that once fell on that ancient empire, one of the signs by which its stubborn ruler was gradually worn down. Here the picture is deliberately flipped. Now it is the enemy's side producing the frogs, conjuring the unclean little omens as a tool of deception rather than suffering them as a judgment. It is a small, pointed reminder woven into the text that the enemy is not inventing anything new here. He is running, badly, a routine that heaven has seen and answered before, borrowing the props of an old defeat and somehow failing to notice how that story ended for the man standing in his exact position. They converge on a location the text gives a name that has since become shorthand for the end of the world itself, Armageddon. In practice, it refers to a real region, a plain with a long and blood-soaked history of ancient battles, but the name long ago outgrew its geography and now simply means the final confrontation, the last stand, the place where everything is decided. And as the armies of a unified planet mass there, the situation on the ground looks, briefly, exactly as grim as the beast intends. Jerusalem, the prize, is half taken. The faithful are surrounded, the overwhelming force is assembled, the trap is closed, and by every visible measure the beast is about to win his final victory and stamp out the last flicker of opposition once and for all. It is worth appreciating the mood in the enemy camp at this exact moment, because it makes what follows so much sharper. From their vantage point, there is no story left to tell. The math is simple and entirely in their favour. They have the numbers, they have the ground, they have the momentum, and they have a leader who has never once lost. Every previous obstacle fell before him. Every gamble paid off. The idea that anything could still go wrong for them has become, after 7 years of unbroken success, almost literally unthinkable. And that total, unshakable confidence is precisely the condition under which people stop watching the sky. They are so certain the ending is already written, that not one of them is bothering to look up, which is naturally the exact direction the ending is about to arrive from. And then, in the single most anticipated moment of the entire story, the sky breaks open. The earth itself splits. Into the middle of that assembled army, at the precise instant of its apparent triumph, comes the one arrival nobody in the beast camp ever truly believed would happen. The real one. The genuine article the whole long forgery was built to imitate. The true Messiah returns, and this time he does not slip in quietly. There is a mountain just outside Jerusalem, the Mount of Olives, and the old prophecy in Zechariah pointed to it with startling precision centuries in advance. His feet, it said, would stand upon that mountain, and when they did, the mountain would split straight down the middle, cleaving in two as the ground itself announces the arrival of its maker. That is the entrance. Not a manger this time. Not a quiet, overlooked berth in a forgotten corner of somebody else's empire. The planet cracks open to make room for him. This is the contrast the entire story has been holding its breath for, and it is worth savouring slowly. The first time the true Messiah came into the world, he came in weakness. The very weakness the counterfeit so carefully studied and copied. He came humble, gentle, easily overlooked, a servant who was mocked and rejected and killed. The forgery imitated that lowly entrance exactly, wearing borrowed humility as camouflage, betting that the world would never spot the real one behind the meek disguise. But this second arrival is nothing whatsoever like the first, and the beast has no counterfeit prepared for it, because it is the one move he never once imagined he would have to answer. This time the Messiah does not come as a lamb to be slaughtered. He comes as a judge, riding a white horse, followed by the armies of heaven arrayed in spotless white, and there is nothing gentle or overlookable about him at all. The servant has become the returning king, and the pretender who spent an entire career impersonating him is about to meet the original face to face. And notice one more thing about this arrival, because it is the final and most complete reversal of everything the beast built his power on. Every wonder the enemy ever produced was curated. The fire from the sky was staged for an audience. The resurrection was managed, framed, and narrated by a waiting propagandist. The whole cult ran on carefully controlled spectacle, on miracles delivered at the right moment to the right crowd, with the right man standing by to explain their meaning. This arrival needs none of that. There is no camera to position, no false prophet to spin it, no marketing department deciding how best to sell it. The sky simply opens and every eye on the planet sees it at once, with no one standing by to tell them what it means, because for the first time in the entire story, something is happening that requires no interpreter at all. The genuine article does not need to be sold. It only needs to appear, and the difference between it and every fake that came before is instantly, universally, undeniably obvious. What happens next is the part everyone expects to be an epic clash. The war to end all wars, two great powers meeting in a battle for the ages. It is not, and that anticlimax is the whole point. There is no drawn-out fight, no uncertain struggle, no moment where the outcome hangs in doubt. The beast gathered the militaries of an entire planet, the greatest concentration of force ever assembled in history, and against the one who returns it, amounts to precisely nothing. The text says he strikes down the opposition with the sword that comes out of his mouth, which is a poetic way of saying he does not need weapons at all. He speaks, and it is finished. The same voice that once spoke the world into existence needs only to speak again, and the mightiest army ever fielded is undone in an instant, thoroughly, completely, without a contest worthy of the name. It is worth pausing on the strangeness of that, a conquest won without a single conventional weapon, because it says something the whole story has been quietly building toward. The beast fought the way the world fights, with force and fear and manipulation, and the slow leverage of controlling who gets to eat. The one who returns does not lower himself to any of it. He does not out-scheme the schemer or outgun the army. He simply speaks, and reality rearranges itself to match, because the word of the one who made reality was never a request that could be resisted in the first place. It is the same power that started everything, turned now to ending this. There is no arms race here, no clever tactics, no real doubt about the outcome, and that very absence of drama is itself the message. When the actual author of the story finally steps onto the page, the villain does not get a climactic duel. He gets a sentence, in both meanings of the word. The old text marks the totality of the reversal, with one grimly ironic image. An angel stands in the sun and calls out to the birds of the air, inviting them to a great feast, the supper of God. And the meal being served is the defeated army. Those who spent the whole story consuming the world, feeding on it, devouring everything in their path, end up as the banquet themselves, the ultimate turning of the tables. It is not a pretty picture, and it is not meant to be. It is meant to make unmistakably clear that the ones who set themselves up to swallow the earth have, in the end, simply become food. The predator, one final time, discovers a little too late that it was never actually at the top of the chain. Then come the two arrests that close out the counterfeit trinity, and there is a savage poetry in how each of them ends. The beast and the false prophet, the two who ran the whole show, the impostor god and his tireless high priest, are seized and thrown, alive, into a lake of fire. Not killed and buried, thrown in alive, which spares them even the small dignity of an ordinary ending. Think, for a moment, about the irony of that fate landing on this man in particular. This is the being who staged his own death and resurrection, who conquered the grave on live television and turned it into the foundation of a global religion. And now, at the very finish, he is denied the one trick that made him. There is no rising from this. The great counterfeit resurrection has no sequel. The man who pretended to defeat death is handed over to the one fate he cannot perform his way out of, and the false prophet, the voice that spent years dressing him up as holy, goes in right alongside him. That leaves one figure, the oldest of them all, the one who was behind the entire thing from before the beginning, the dragon. And here the story finally closes the loop it opened in its very first movements. Remember the ancient war, the one that started long before humanity, the defeat in the heavens that sent the loser tumbling down to relocate his fight onto the earth. Everything since the whole long forgery, the rise and the mark and the temple, was that same defeated spirit refusing to accept the loss and trying to counterfeit a crown he could never win. Now the account is finally settled. The dragon is seized and bound, chained, removed from the board, the ancient rebel at last watching his rebellion arrive at the end it was always going to reach. The war that opened the story is, at long last, brought to its close. It is worth sitting for a moment with what the removal of that one figure actually changes, because it is easy to rush straight past it. For the entire span of human history, according to these texts, there has been a liar in the room, an accuser, a deceiver, a voice whispering the oldest falsehoods into every generation, present at every rationalization and every self-deception and every quiet decision to put oneself in God's place. Take that figure off the board, chain him, remove him completely, and the world becomes something it has never once been within memory. A place where the deceiver is simply not there. No whisper, no accusation, no ancient hand tilting the scales toward ruin. Whatever else the age that follows turns out to be, it begins with the single most persistent source of human misery finally locked away, and it is genuinely difficult to imagine what people become when a pressure that has always been present and almost never noticed is at last lifted off them. Woven through this whole settling of accounts is a quiet sorting, the separating of the two roads the story has been laying side by side since the very first mark. There were those who took the beast's brand to keep their place in his world, and those who refused it and were locked out and hunted for the refusing. For a long, dark while, the first road looked obviously wiser. It led to bread, to safety, to belonging, to survival. The second led to exclusion, and worse. But roads are judged by where they end, not by how they feel somewhere in the middle, and here at the finish the two destinations finally come clear. The choice that looked foolish in the darkness turns out to have been the only wise one all along, and the choice that looked sensible turns out to have bought a very short comfort at a very long price. It is the oldest lesson in the whole tradition, dressed here in its most dramatic clothes. What you bow to matters, and it matters most precisely when bowing is easiest. And here is where the more familiar tellings of this tale usually stop, at the defeat, as though the destruction of the villain were the whole story. But it is not the whole story, and to end there is to miss the entire point of everything that came before it. Because what follows the defeat is the very thing the counterfeit spent its whole existence imitating, and could never actually deliver. A real kingdom. Think back over the long catalogue of fakes we have watched him build. He offered a false peace, resting on one man and hiding a trap. He offered a false unity, a cage marketed as a shelter. He offered a false resurrection, a false worship, a false god seated in a stolen temple. Every single one of them was a hollow copy of something genuine, the shape of a good thing with the substance quietly scooped out. And now, with the forger gone, the genuine articles finally arrive. The old text describes an age, often called the 1,000-year reign, in which the true king rules the world directly, and this time everything the beast only imitated becomes real. Real peace, not balanced on a single fragile personality but flowing from the actual source of it. Real order, not enforced by a mark and a hungry image but arising simply because the rightful ruler is finally on the rightful throne. Real unity, not the airless sameness of a cage but the genuine harmony of a world set right. Everything the counterfeit promised and could not keep, the original simply is. The difference between the two, it turns out, was never in the promises themselves. It was in whether the one making them could actually deliver, and only one of them ever could. And there is one more reversal folded into that new age, aimed squarely at the ones who suffered most to reach it. Remember the faithful from the darkest stretch, the cornered and the hunted, the ones who refused the mark and paid for it, the ones who died with the word no still on their lips rather than bow to the counterfeit. The story does not forget them, and it does not leave them in the ground. Just as it drew a sharp line earlier between the beast's staged resurrection and the genuine one granted to the two witnesses, it now extends that same real resurrection to the faithful who fell. They are raised, vindicated, and given a place in the very kingdom they refused to sell their souls to avoid. The ones who lost everything for holding the line turn out to have made, in hindsight, the only good investment in the entire story. Everyone who bowed to keep what they had lost it. Everyone who refused and lost everything gained the one kingdom that was never going to fall. It is the final scoreboard, and it reads exactly backwards from how it looked on the worst day. Which brings us, at last, back out of the story and around to you, because there is a reason this ancient account has never quite stopped feeling personal. A reason we hinted at all the way back at the very beginning. It would be comforting to file the whole thing away as a tale about one uniquely monstrous figure, a singular villain with nothing to do with the rest of us. But that reading misses the most uncomfortable truth buried inside it. The core of what made the beast was not his power, or his charisma, or even his supernatural backing. It was a single decision, the oldest one there is. He looked at the throne that belongs to God, and he decided it ought to belong to him instead. He put himself in the one place that was never his to take. And if we are honest with ourselves, that exact impulse is not some exotic evil reserved for prophesied monsters. It is the quiet, familiar temptation that lives, in smaller and much better disguised forms, in every single one of us. Every time a person decides they know better than their maker, that they will be the final authority over their own life, that they will sit on the throne of their own little kingdom and answer to no one above them, they are running, in miniature, the very same program the beast simply ran all the way to its logical conclusion. He is not the exception to human nature. He is the extreme of it, the endpoint of a road that begins with something as ordinary and as respectable as wanting to be fully in charge of yourself and to owe nothing to the one who made you. The story, mercifully, does not leave that diagnosis hanging there without an answer. The whole long account of the counterfeit exists in the end to point at the original, to make the genuine article unmistakable by showing you the fake in exhaustive detail. There was a false messiah who demanded everything and delivered only ruin. There is also a true one, who asks not to be worshipped out of fear but to be trusted out of love, who came the first time not to seize a throne but to lay his own life down, and who offers to anyone willing to receive it exactly the thing the counterfeit could never give. A way down off the throne that was crushing you, a pardon for every time you tried to sit on it, a place in the real kingdom rather than the fake one, and the single detail that matters most, the one this whole story is quietly built to deliver, is that the door to that offer stands open right now, today, in the ordinary present moment where you happen to be listening to this. Not later, when it is more convenient. Not at some distant point when the frogs are hopping and the armies are gathering and it has become far too late to choose. Now, the turning, the change of heart the old texts call repentance, is not a grand or complicated thing at all. It is simply stepping down from a throne that was never yours to begin with, and trusting the one whose throne it actually is. The beast wanted to be God, and lost absolutely everything reaching for it. The invitation held out to you is the exact opposite move, and it costs nothing but the pride that was going to sink you anyway. The door is open, it will not stand open forever, and what you decide to do while it still does is, in the end, the only part of this entire story that was ever truly left in your hands. That is the whole of it then, from the quiet, exhausted world that first made room for him, all the way to the split mountain, the settled war, and the open door. A story that spends 13 long chapters showing you, in relentless and patient detail, exactly how a lie can be made to look like salvation, so that in the 14th you might finally recognize the truth the instant you see it. The beast was always, from his first overlooked step to his very last, a counterfeit of someone real. And a counterfeit, however convincing, has only ever proven one single thing simply by existing. That somewhere out there is an original worth all the trouble of forging. The long shadow was only ever pointing back at the light that cast it. What you choose to do with that light is the one question the story hands back to you, unanswered, and quietly leaves in your keeping alone.